Born in 1767 in the quiet wilderness of the Carolinas, Andrew Jackson's early life was shaped by hardship and loss. Orphaned before he could truly know his parents, he grew up in the chaos of the American Revolution, with a spirit hardened by adversity. Jackson's journey would carry him through some of the most defining moments in American history, rising from a humble frontier childhood to the highest office in the land. His life unfolded during a time of change, struggle, and expansion, as the United States found its way through war, political upheaval, and cultural growth. Jackson's story is one of ambition and resolve. A man shaped by both personal loss and victory, he rose to prominence through fierce determination. Known for his bold decisions and controversial actions, Jackson's legacy remains one of the most complex in American history. From the battlefields of New Orleans to the halls of the White House, his impact is profound, though not without its shadows. As you settle in, let this quiet recounting of his life, unhurried, steady, and gentle, take you through the years. Allow the rhythm of Jackson's journey to guide your thoughts as you drift towards sleep. If you find comfort in these stories, feel free to like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. But for now, let the peaceful unfolding of his life gently carry you into rest. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15th, 1767, in a small log cabin in the backwoods of the Carolinas, near the border of North and South Carolina. His birthplace, like his future life, was far removed from the comforts of the cities and the formal institutions of the colonies. Jackson's parents, Scots-Irish immigrants, had settled in this frontier region seeking a new life, far from the rigid class structures of the Old World. His father, a farmer and landowner, died before Jackson was born, leaving his mother, Elizabeth, to raise him and his two older brothers on her own. The family's early years were marked by struggle and instability. Jackson's mother, determined to provide for her sons, worked tirelessly to make a living from the land. But the economic realities of the frontier were harsh, and the Jackson family often lived on the edge of survival. Despite these difficulties, Elizabeth instilled in her children a strong sense of resilience and self-reliance. However, tragedy struck when Jackson was just 14 years old. In 1781, during the final stages of the American Revolution, Elizabeth Jackson died from illness. At this young age, Jackson found himself alone, orphaned, and with no means of support. Though he had been an independent, strong-willed child, the loss of his mother was a devastating blow. For the next few years, Jackson lived with various relatives, but he never felt truly at home. His experiences as an orphan were formative, leaving him with a deep, lasting sense of vulnerability and a determination to make something of himself despite the odds. It was during these early years of hardship that Jackson began to form his unshakable belief in the importance of personal perseverance and strength, qualities that would define his character throughout his life. At the age of 13, Jackson joined the Continental Army, eager to contribute to the fight for American independence. He was soon captured by British forces, along with his brother Robert. The young Jackson, along with his brother, was treated harshly by the British. Jackson's experiences as a prisoner of war would leave deep scars, both physically and emotionally. British officers ordered him to polish their boots, and when he refused, he was struck with a sword. The young Jackson, already defiant and hardened by his experiences, would carry these resentments toward the British for the rest of his life. His brother Robert died of illness while imprisoned, and Jackson himself was eventually released. At just 14 years old, he'd already been exposed to the brutal realities of war. His anger toward the British, as well as his deepening sense of duty to the American cause, would become central to his identity. The scars from his time as a prisoner would mark not just his body, but also his character, instilling in him a fierce, unyielding sense of justice and a drive to protect his country and its people. After the war, Jackson returned to the Carolinas, but he soon moved to the frontier regions of Tennessee, where he began his adult life. His early life was far from easy, and his experiences during the Revolution, both as a soldier and a prisoner, shaped the course of his future. The frontier was a harsh place, where survival depended on personal strength and resilience. Jackson, having learned these lessons from a young age, quickly adapted to the rugged conditions of the land. His early years on the frontier, filled with hardship and loss, would set the stage for his rise to prominence in later life. While still a young man, Jackson started to study law, despite the absence of formal schooling. His interest in the law came naturally, as he had spent years learning about justice and duty during his military service. His tenacity and thirst for knowledge led him to study law on his own, and eventually he was admitted to the bar in 1787. By 1788, Jackson had established himself as a lawyer in Tennessee, where he began to make a name for himself. Although still in his early 20s, Jackson was already developing the traits that would define his career: ambition, confidence, and a relentless drive for success. It was during his years as a young lawyer that Jackson began to shape his reputation as someone who could not be easily intimidated. His legal career was marked by his willingness to take on the most difficult cases and his determination to win. Jackson's rise as a lawyer and his success in the growing frontier settlement of Nashville set the stage for his future political career. But it was not just his legal work that helped him gain prominence. His early work as a land speculator also gave him the financial resources to expand his influence. In the years that followed, Jackson would continue to rise in political and social circles. His early life, filled with hardship, loss, and resilience, had forged the core of his character. As he matured, Jackson became known for his unwavering determination and his uncompromising belief in personal strength. His reputation, both as a lawyer and as a man of ambition, would pave the way for his future in politics and military service. But for now, his life remained grounded in the frontier, far from the political centers of the nation, as he continued to build the foundation for a future that would eventually lead him to the presidency. The American Revolution, the war that had so deeply shaped the course of Jackson's early life, was still raging when the young Andrew Jackson was thrust into its chaos. At the age of 13, he joined the Continental Army, eager to play his part in the fight for independence. The war had reached its final stages, but the bitterness of the conflict and the determination to secure liberty were still felt across the colonies. Jackson's first taste of battle came in 1781, when he and his brother Robert were captured by British forces during a skirmish. The brothers, already scarred by the losses they had endured, found themselves at the mercy of their captors. The British soldiers treated the young Jackson harshly. Jackson, refusing to polish the boots of a British officer, was struck with a sword across his hand, leaving a deep scar that would remain with him for the rest of his life. The young Jackson, though inexperienced, faced the brutality of war with the resolve that would come to define his character. His anger at the British for their treatment of him and his brother would fester, fueling his bitterness toward the British Empire throughout his life. His deep resentment would be compounded by the tragic loss of his brother Robert, who died of illness while imprisoned. The young Andrew Jackson, already orphaned once, was left with only his own fortitude and will to survive. The experience of being a prisoner of war was formative for Jackson. In those moments of captivity, surrounded by the enemy, he experienced the stark realities of the violence and hardship that came with war. Yet despite the cruelty, Jackson's spirit was not broken. If anything, it became harder and more resolute. The experiences of deprivation and the sight of his brother's death at such a young age shaped his character in ways that would influence every decision he made in the years to come. When Jackson was eventually released, his return to the Carolinas marked the end of his brief but intense involvement in the American Revolution. But the emotional scars of his captivity remained with him for years to come. His anger at the British, his grief over his brother's death, and his growing awareness of the cruelty of war would remain central to his worldview. These formative experiences, at a time when he was still just a boy, would plant the seeds of his future desire for strength, control, and a deeply personal sense of justice. It wasn't just the external hardships that Jackson endured during this period that left a mark, it was also the internal transformation he underwent. The young Jackson, once a boy of relatively little distinction, emerged from captivity with a deep sense of self-reliance. It was during these years that he began to view the world through the lens of personal strength and resilience, a philosophy that would guide him throughout his life. After the war, Jackson returned to his homeland, but the post-revolutionary years would not be kind to him. The death of his mother and his own experiences as a prisoner had left him with a deep sense of isolation. For much of his early life, Jackson had been surrounded by loss, his parents, his brother, and the ravages of war. These experiences left him with an abiding loneliness that he would carry with him, even as he rose to political and military prominence. Despite these personal struggles, Jackson's resilience was unmistakable. His hatred for the British Empire grew deeper, his desire for control more pronounced, and his ambition began to take shape. He had seen the worst of humanity, both on the battlefield and in captivity, and he was determined not to be a passive observer of history. Instead, he would be an active force, shaping events rather than letting them shape him. The years following the Revolution were marked by Jackson's struggle to find a place for himself in a rapidly changing world. The country was in its infancy, and Jackson's world was still one of frontier towns, small courts, and a constant battle for survival. Yet, even as he navigated this challenging terrain, he began to lay the foundation for his future rise. His work as a lawyer, land speculator, and politician in Tennessee would soon establish him as a key player in the region's development. But the experiences of his youth, marked by captivity, loss, and a bitter thirst for justice, remained etched in his character, shaping every decision he would make in the years to come. Through the suffering, the loss, and the hardship, Jackson began to crystallize the principles that would define his life: self-reliance, personal strength, and a refusal to be controlled by others. These formative experiences, though painful, would lead him down a path toward leadership, one that would take him to the highest office in the land. His youthful experiences as a prisoner of war and his personal losses would leave him with a fierce determination that would fuel his rise to power, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As Jackson transitioned into adulthood, the shadows of his early experiences remained with him. His anger, while no longer directed solely at the British, would fuel his contentious relationships with political opponents, his drive for personal success, and his uncompromising approach to leadership. But for now, the young Jackson's path was still unfolding, shaped by a mixture of resilience and rage, the likes of which would propel him through the trials to come. After the American Revolution ended, young Andrew Jackson found himself adrift in a world full of both promise and hardship. At the age of 14 he was orphaned, and the death of his mother left him without the guidance and warmth that had, until then, been his only steady support. The harsh realities of frontier life in the Carolinas would now be his only teacher. With no family to rely on, Jackson became deeply independent, an orphan among the frontier communities, where people were often more concerned with their own survival than with the well-being of others. For several years, Jackson lived with various relatives, moving from one household to another, but he never quite felt at home. His early years, filled with loss, had already shaped a young man who preferred solitude and personal resolve over dependence on others. The absence of family left a profound loneliness in Jackson's heart, but it also forged in him a sense of self-sufficiency that would guide him in the years to come. In this period, Jackson began to cultivate the core values that would define his character: independence, resilience, and ambition. He could not afford to be weak emotionally or physically. It was during this time that he began to turn his attention toward a future that was filled with the uncertainty of frontier life. Jackson's deep loneliness, though painful, would ultimately become the foundation for his inner strength. His resolve, tested by personal loss and isolation, hardened, and his vision for his future began to take shape. Jackson's ambition found a channel in his desire to succeed in a world where few succeeded without a great deal of determination. By his late teens, he had set his sights on becoming a lawyer. His lack of formal education could have been a hindrance, but Jackson was undeterred. He began studying law independently, using books to teach himself the intricacies of legal systems and practices. He was a self-taught student, learning what he could through books and through practical experience. At this time, Jackson was introduced to the rough and rugged world of frontier law, where survival often depended as much on one's toughness as on one's ability to argue a case. The frontier was a place where life was unpredictable and often dangerous, and Jackson was learning to navigate this volatile environment, gradually building his reputation as a fierce and determined individual. As a young man, Jackson worked in a small legal office, helping other attorneys with their cases and learning the trade through observation. The legal system was still new and largely unrefined in the frontier regions, but Jackson's drive and ability to grasp the essentials of the law quickly earned him respect among his peers. This self-reliance, this willingness to carve out a future on his own terms, was a reflection of his personal philosophy. Jackson had learned early in life that, when you had nothing, you had to depend on your own skills and resolve. By 1787, Jackson had moved to Nashville, a growing settlement on the frontier, where he would begin to build his future. The move to Tennessee marked a new chapter in Jackson's life, where he would take the next steps in both his legal career and his personal development. Tennessee was still a wild place, full of opportunity but also danger. Jackson, never one to shy away from challenge, immersed himself in the rapidly growing town. He began to establish himself as a lawyer, and by the early 1790s had set his sights on becoming a landowner and businessman as well. In Tennessee, Jackson's legal career flourished. The region was full of disputes over land titles, land ownership, and other matters, and Jackson soon became known as a lawyer who was both aggressive and knowledgeable. His ability to take on difficult cases, combined with his growing reputation as a man of iron will, began to draw the attention of the area's political elites. It wasn't long before Jackson was invited into political circles, where he could begin to make his mark on the broader world beyond the courtroom. But even as he found success in the world of law, Jackson's personal life remained in turmoil. The grief of losing his mother and his childhood had left emotional scars that would last throughout his life. Though he worked hard and achieved much in his early years, Jackson could never quite shake the sense of isolation that came with being an orphan. His strong, silent nature reflected a man who'd been forced to deal with loss at a very young age, and while he'd overcome many of his hardships, the emotional toll of his early life never fully left him. As Jackson continued to build his career, he began to gain a reputation for being an individual of both remarkable ability and unyielding determination. Yet despite his success in the legal and political worlds, there was always a part of him that remained deeply lonely, driven by the loss of his parents and the harshness of the world he had known. His ambition to rise above his circumstances was matched only by his inability to escape the shadow of his early life. The loneliness he felt in his youth would remain with him throughout his adult life. While Jackson would go on to lead the country as its president, the echoes of that solitude and loss would always be present in his psyche. As he ascended through the ranks of political power, he often found himself struggling with his own inner turmoil. His drive for success, his desire to protect the nation, and his need to prove himself were all rooted in the deep scars of his childhood. Jackson's story was one of transformation, a journey from the wilderness of his youth to the halls of power, but it was also a journey that was shaped by the loss and hardship that marked his earliest years. In Tennessee, Jackson would find success, but his roots remained firmly planted in the experiences of his childhood. The lessons he had learned through isolation, loss, and self-reliance would continue to guide him as he navigated the political world. His story was not just one of triumph, but of personal reckoning, and it would shape the way he governed in the years to come. After the end of the Revolutionary War, young Andrew Jackson, orphaned and alone, found himself at a crossroads in life. The hardships of his early years shaped a resilient and determined young man, and his future would unfold in ways that few could have predicted. With no formal education, Jackson relied on his own tenacity and drive to teach himself the skills necessary to survive and succeed. One of the most significant decisions he made during this time was to pursue a career in law. Though many believed that a self-taught individual would not thrive in such a competitive field, Jackson proved that sheer determination could overcome even the lack of formal schooling. By 1787, Jackson had begun studying law in earnest, using every available resource to learn. His studies were intense and focused. Living in the frontier town of Salisbury, North Carolina, he would walk miles to access books and resources. He became deeply absorbed in legal texts, developing a strong understanding of the law not just in theory, but also in the practical realities of frontier life. There were few legal professionals on the frontier, and Jackson soon realized that there was an opportunity for him to carve out a future by filling that gap. Jackson's decision to become a lawyer, despite the odds, marked the beginning of his rise in the world of politics and public life. The legal profession, especially in frontier communities, was highly competitive and often involved more than just legal skill. It required the ability to navigate complex social dynamics, build relationships, and, perhaps most importantly, maintain an unwavering resolve. These qualities, which Jackson had cultivated in the hardships of his youth, were well suited for this profession. In 1788, after completing his studies, Jackson passed the bar exam and became a licensed attorney in North Carolina. Though the young Jackson was still a stranger in the legal world, his reputation quickly grew as a lawyer who would fight fiercely for his clients. He earned a name for himself by taking on difficult cases, and soon he was regarded as a promising young lawyer in the region. With his legal career beginning to take shape, Jackson decided to move to Tennessee in 1791, a decision that would ultimately change the course of his life. Tennessee, still a frontier territory, was a place of opportunity and challenge in equal measure. The region was growing rapidly, and Jackson saw the potential to make his mark both as a lawyer and as a landowner. It was a land that needed men of action, people who were willing to put in the hard work and fight for their place in the world. Jackson, ever the determined young man, was ready to take on the challenge. Upon arriving in Tennessee, Jackson immediately set to work. He began practicing law in the burgeoning town of Nashville, where the population was growing and the political environment was ripe for someone like him, ambitious, strong-willed, and determined. Jackson's legal skills combined with his personal drive made him a natural fit for the new frontier society. It wasn't long before he became a respected figure in the town, representing settlers, landowners, and others who sought his expertise. Beyond his legal work, Jackson became involved in the political landscape of Tennessee. His career as a lawyer provided him with the connections and the resources needed to begin his ascent into the region's political arena. His leadership qualities, honed through years of personal struggle, were becoming apparent. The young lawyer, who had once been a prisoner of war, now found himself navigating the corridors of political power in a rapidly growing region. During this time, Jackson also began to explore opportunities in land speculation. The region was teeming with land, and Jackson, ever the opportunist, began acquiring parcels of land and engaging in real estate transactions. His experience as a land speculator would prove to be instrumental in his later political career, as it allowed him to amass wealth and influence. His rise in Tennessee was swift and significant. By 1796, just a few short years after his arrival in the region, Jackson had established himself as a key figure in both the legal and political communities. He'd been elected as a delegate to the state's constitutional convention, and in 1797 he became Tennessee's first U.S. congressman. His political career was taking off, and he was quickly becoming known for his forthright nature, his willingness to fight for what he believed in, and his unflinching confidence. Jackson's early years in Tennessee were crucial in shaping the man he would become. They were marked by a deep sense of purpose and a relentless drive to succeed. His legal career, political ascent, and involvement in land speculation all played a role in molding him into a figure who would go on to become one of the most influential presidents in American history. But these early years also gave Jackson a deep understanding of the challenges of the frontier. He knew firsthand the difficulties faced by settlers and the volatile nature of life on the edge of civilization. Yet for all his success in Tennessee, Jackson was not without his personal struggles. His life had been one of hardship, and though he was now respected and successful, there was still an underlying sense of loneliness and loss that he could not escape. His ambition and his drive for success were fueled by a desire to prove himself in a world that had shown him little mercy. As he built his career and his wealth in Tennessee, Jackson's inner demons, shaped by the years of hardship, loss, and struggle, continued to drive him forward. In these years, Jackson's story was beginning to unfold into something larger. His legal acumen, his growing political influence, and his ability to build wealth in a rapidly expanding region were all setting the stage for his rise to national prominence. But even as he gained power and respect, the young man who had once been an orphan, a prisoner of war, and a lonely survivor still carried with him the emotional scars of his youth. By 1812, Andrew Jackson had already built a reputation as a determined lawyer, landowner, and political figure, but it was his military service, particularly during the War of 1812, that would elevate him into the national spotlight and solidify his place in American history. The War of 1812, fought between the United States and Great Britain, was a time of great tension, and it would lead to Jackson's most famous military victory, the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson's military career began in earnest in 1813, when he was appointed as a major general in the Tennessee militia during the Creek War, part of the broader conflict in the South during the War of 1812. Although not yet a seasoned military leader, Jackson quickly demonstrated his fierce leadership, decisiveness, and determination to protect American interests. His leadership during the Creek War was marked by several significant victories, and he earned the admiration of his men and the respect of his superiors. His success against the Creek, a Native American tribe allied with the British, was one of the first signs that Jackson had the potential to lead American forces to victory. The battle that would come to define Jackson's legacy, however, came in 1815 at the Battle of New Orleans. The British, having defeated Napoleon and freeing up forces from Europe, sought to control the Mississippi River and weaken American power in the region. Jackson, now commanding a diverse force of regular troops, militia, pirates, and even freed slaves, was tasked with defending the port city of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans took place on January 8, 1815, and it would be a stunning victory for Jackson and his troops. Despite being outnumbered and facing a well-equipped British force, Jackson's troops held firm and delivered a crushing defeat. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, while American losses were fewer than 100. The victory was a remarkable achievement and demonstrated Jackson's extraordinary leadership and tactical skill. His ability to rally a ragtag force and outsmart the British in a direct confrontation marked him as one of the great military leaders of his time. The Battle of New Orleans catapulted Jackson to national fame. Though the war had officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814, news of the treaty had not yet reached the soldiers in the field, and the battle was fought after peace had been agreed upon. However, the victory became a symbol of American resilience and strength. Jackson was hailed as a hero, and his victory over the British made him an overnight national sensation. The battle, which had been one of the last engagements of the war, marked the end of the conflict and allowed Jackson to secure his place in American history. However, Jackson's victory at New Orleans was not just about military glory. It also symbolized the values that Jackson held dear: self-reliance, resilience, and the ability to rise above adversity. His triumph in the battle was a reflection of his own personal journey from an orphaned child to a hardened military leader. The battle demonstrated that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, Jackson was willing to fight for what he believed in and never back down. Jackson's victory at New Orleans brought him into the public eye, but it also made him a controversial figure. His brutal tactics, including his treatment of prisoners and his use of the militia, earned him both admiration and criticism. Jackson was not one to shy away from conflict, and his willingness to take extreme measures to ensure victory set him apart from many of his contemporaries. In the aftermath of the battle, Jackson's reputation as a military hero grew. He was celebrated by the American public for his decisive action, his ability to lead under pressure, and his unwavering commitment to American interests. The Battle of New Orleans was a turning point in Jackson's life, and it would forever define his political and military career. But even as Jackson basked in the glory of his victory, he remained a man of strong convictions and uncompromising principles. The Battle of New Orleans had solidified his place in history, but it had also given him a taste of the power and influence he could wield. Jackson, now a hero to the American people, began to set his sights on higher political office, recognizing that his newfound fame and popularity could be leveraged to further his ambitions. The military glory he achieved during the War of 1812, and particularly at New Orleans, would become a cornerstone of his political identity. His rise from humble beginnings to national hero had made him a symbol of perseverance, strength, and the American spirit. But Jackson's military career was just one part of his complex legacy, and as he began to shift his focus toward national politics, the same determination and fiery spirit that had served him in battle would drive his pursuit of the presidency. In the years following the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson continued to build his political career. His hero status had earned him respect and influence across the nation, and he began to make alliances that would serve him well in the political battles to come. His military victories, combined with his personal determination, were the foundation of the public image he would carry into the White House. In the years following his great victory at the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson's fame as a military leader only grew, but it was the conflict with the Seminole Indians in Florida that would further define his legacy and deepen his involvement in the nation's politics. The years between 1816 and 1821 were a time of great significance in Jackson's life. While Jackson had proven himself a capable leader in battle, the Seminole War would test his judgment and mark a pivotal moment in his rise to national prominence. The Seminoles, a group of Native American tribes living in Florida, had long been a thorn in the side of American expansion. Many of them had been forcibly relocated to Florida from Georgia and Alabama, but tensions with American settlers continued to grow. Additionally, runaway slaves sought refuge with the Seminoles, further complicating the situation. With the War of 1812 fresh in the minds of Americans and Florida still under Spanish control, Jackson saw the growing threat of the Seminoles as an opportunity to expand American influence in the region. In 1816, Jackson was ordered to lead a campaign against the Seminoles, who had been launching raids across the Georgia-Florida border. The mission, initially small in scope, would soon escalate into a full-scale military intervention. Jackson's march into Florida in 1818 was decisive and aggressive. Though Florida was technically a Spanish territory, Jackson's actions revealed his willingness to act beyond the authority given to him, a characteristic that would come to define much of his career. His actions in Florida were marked by boldness, but also by controversy. Jackson, disregarding orders from the US government, captured several Spanish forts in Florida. He then executed 2 British nationals accused of inciting the Seminoles to resist American expansion. Jackson's disregard for diplomatic protocol and his direct military action raised significant concerns among both American officials and European powers. Yet despite the controversy, Jackson's actions effectively ended the Seminole resistance and secured American interests in Florida. The Spanish were unable to hold Florida, and the diplomatic pressure that Jackson had placed on the Spanish government eventually led to the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, the treaty named after U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and Spanish Foreign Minister Luis de Onís saw Spain cede Florida to the United States in exchange for American claims to Texas. This acquisition of Florida was a crucial step in the westward expansion of the United States and reinforced Jackson's image as a decisive and effective military leader. Although Jackson's actions in Florida led to a significant territorial gain for the United States, they also raised questions about the limits of presidential power and the relationship between the military and civilian authorities. Jackson had acted with great independence, without waiting for instructions from the government. This willingness to take matters into his own hands demonstrated both his courage and his sometimes reckless disregard for authority. Despite the controversy surrounding his actions in Florida, Jackson's successes in the Seminole War brought him widespread acclaim. His military victories earned him the admiration of the American public, and his name became synonymous with national strength and bold leadership. Jackson's reputation as a leader who would not hesitate to act decisively, even at the risk of overstepping his authority, set the stage for his future political ambitions. But Jackson's success in Florida was not without its costs. The violence and the military actions he took in Florida against both the Seminoles and the Spanish left a lasting imprint on Jackson's character. His determination to expand American territory was matched by his willingness to impose his will on others, and this would continue to define his political career. As Jackson's role in the Seminole War concluded, his ambitions shifted from military leadership to political leadership. He saw firsthand the power and influence that came with military success, but he also realized the political capital he could gain from his actions. His time in Florida marked the beginning of his transition from a military leader to a political figure with eyes set on higher office. The Seminole War and the acquisition of Florida also had broader implications for the United States. The acquisition of the territory was a significant milestone in the country's quest for expansion, further solidifying the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent. Jackson's role in securing Florida for the United States helped reinforce this vision, and his leadership in the conflict was an essential part of his growing political legacy. Jackson's time in Florida was a defining period in his life, both as a military leader and as a figure whose influence was beginning to stretch beyond the battlefield. It was clear that Jackson was a man of action, someone who could achieve results through bold and sometimes unorthodox methods. Yet his time in Florida also highlighted the complexities of his character. His willingness to act decisively was a strength, but it was also a source of tension between him and those who questioned the limits of his power. As Jackson returned to Tennessee after his victory in Florida, he found himself at the height of his military career. His reputation as a hero was firmly established, and the road ahead seemed clear. He would continue to build upon his reputation, eventually turning his attention to the world of politics, where his rise to the presidency seemed inevitable. But before he could embark on his political journey, Jackson had to navigate the shifting landscape of American politics, where his boldness and his willingness to challenge authority would serve him well, but also create enemies. Jackson's actions in the Seminole War and the subsequent acquisition of Florida helped to further define his legacy as a leader who was unafraid to take risks and act independently. These qualities, combined with his deep sense of personal ambition, would guide him toward the presidency and make him one of the most influential figures in American history. After the Seminole War and his success in securing Florida for the United States, Andrew Jackson's reputation as a fierce and capable leader reached its peak. Yet, his ambition had only just begun to manifest in the realm of politics. Jackson had seen firsthand the power that came with military victories, but he now set his sights on a new battlefield, the political arena. His return to Tennessee in 1821 marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one that would take him from a war hero to a national political figure. Jackson's return to Tennessee in 1821 was not simply the return of a hero to his home state. He had become a symbol of strength and determination, and his popularity was growing rapidly. His military victories, particularly the victory at New Orleans and his leadership in the Seminole War, had earned him widespread acclaim. But Jackson's drive extended beyond just military achievement. He had long harbored a desire to play a more significant role in the nation's politics, and now he was ready to seize the opportunity. In 1822, Jackson began to make his mark in the political landscape of Tennessee, securing the position of U.S. Senator. His rise was swift, but his tenure in the Senate was short-lived. Despite his growing political influence, Jackson found the political process to be filled with complications and compromises that did not sit well with his direct, no-nonsense approach to leadership. In 1824, Jackson's brief time in the Senate was over, but his desire for power had not diminished. He had learned enough about the political system to know that his time had not yet come, and he would need to bide his time until a more significant opportunity arose. The 1824 presidential election was a pivotal moment in Jackson's political career. He had already earned widespread popularity, particularly among the common people who admired his rise from humble beginnings to national hero. His image as a man of the people, someone who understood the struggles of ordinary citizens, played a crucial role in his political appeal. Jackson ran for president in 1824, facing off against a field of strong candidates, including John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. The election was a hard-fought and bitter contest, but Jackson emerged as the clear popular favorite. In the election, Jackson won a plurality of the popular vote and a plurality of the electoral vote, but not a majority. This meant that the election would be decided by the House of Representatives. In what would later be called the corrupt bargain, the House chose John Quincy Adams as the winner, despite Jackson's clear dominance in the popular vote. The decision to elect Adams over Jackson created a great deal of controversy, and Jackson was furious. He believed that the political elite had stolen the election from the people, and the bitterness from this moment would shape the course of his political career in the years to come. Despite his defeat, Jackson's supporters rallied around him, and he became more determined than ever to seek the presidency. The 1824 election marked the beginning of a political rivalry that would define the next several years of American politics. Jackson's supporters, who saw his election as the will of the people, were angered by the outcome, and many began to see Jackson as the true voice of the common people. The belief that Jackson had been robbed of the presidency in 1824 fueled a populist movement that would play a critical role in his political rise. In the aftermath of the election, Jackson focused his energy on building a coalition of supporters who believed in his vision for the country. he was able to tap into the growing dissatisfaction with the political establishment, which many saw as corrupt and out of touch with the needs of ordinary citizens. Jackson's campaign became a rallying cry for those who wanted to see a president who would represent their interests and break the power of the elite. His focus on the needs of the common man and his willingness to challenge the political establishment made him a symbol of change. Jackson's political appeal was based on his image as a man who had risen from nothing to achieve great success. His life story, marked by hardship, resilience, and determination, resonated with many Americans who saw in him a figure who could understand their struggles. He was a man of action, someone who was not afraid to fight for what he believed in. His appeal was not just based on his military victories or her accomplishments. It was rooted in his image as a leader who would stand up for the average person. As Jackson's popularity grew, so did the political opposition to him. His enemies, particularly those in the political establishment, saw him as a threat to their power. The 1824 election had highlighted the divisions between the political elite and the growing populist movement, and the stage was set for Jackson to challenge those divisions head-on in the coming years. Despite his anger over the 1824 election, Jackson's resolve to become president only strengthened. He would not allow the political elite to undermine the will of the people. By the time of the 1828 election, Jackson's political movement had gained significant momentum. The corrupt bargain of 1824 had left many Americans disillusioned with the political system, and Jackson's populist message resonated with voters who felt left behind by the political establishment. Jackson ran again in 1828, this time with a fierce determination to win, and he would not be denied. His campaign, marked by personal attacks on his opponents and an aggressive stance against the political elite, was one of the most bitter and hard-fought elections in American history. The 1828 presidential election was a defining moment not just in Andrew Jackson's life, but in the history of American politics. After the controversial and bitter defeat in the 1824 election, Jackson was more determined than ever to secure the presidency. The political landscape of the United States had shifted since 1824, and Jackson's rise was emblematic of the changing mood in the country. His message of populism, his promise to represent the common man, and his intense disdain for the political elite resonated deeply with many Americans who felt alienated by the political establishment. Jackson's campaign in 1828 was marked by an intensity and a personal touch that was different from the typical political campaigns of the time. He reached out directly to voters, speaking to their concerns and positioning himself as a leader who understood their struggles. Unlike his opponents, who were often seen as part of the established political class, Jackson was viewed as a man who had risen from humble beginnings and was not beholden to any political faction or interest. His image as a military hero, combined with his image as a man of the people, gave him a broad appeal across different regions and social classes. The election of 1828 was one of the most fiercely contested in American history. Jackson's opponent, incumbent President John Quincy Adams, had won the 1824 election in a controversial manner, and his presidency had not been widely popular. The bitter memories of the corrupt bargain, in which Adams had been chosen by the House of Representatives over Jackson, despite his popular vote victory, were still fresh in the minds of many Americans. Jackson's supporters, who felt that the 1824 election had been stolen from him, were determined to make sure that history did not repeat itself. The campaign was marked by personal attacks and mudslinging, with both sides resorting to harsh rhetoric and accusations. Jackson, who had long been known for his fiery temper, did not shy away from the rough and tumble of the election. He and his supporters painted Adams and his allies as elitist and out of touch with the needs of the people, while Adams and his supporters accused Jackson of being hot-headed and unfit for office. The election became not just a contest between two men, but a battle over the future of American democracy itself. In the end, Jackson emerged victorious, winning the election by a wide margin in both the popular vote and the Electoral College. His victory was a reflection of the shifting political tides in America, where a new, more populist approach to politics was beginning to take hold. Jackson's supporters hailed his victory as a triumph for the common man, a sign that ordinary citizens now had a voice in the direction of the nation. It was a moment of great personal vindication for Jackson, who had spent years fighting for this moment after his bitter defeat in 1824. As Jackson prepared to take office in 1829, the expectations for his presidency were high. He was seen as a man who would bring a new style of leadership to the White House, one that was more in tune with the concerns of ordinary Americans. His presidency would signal a shift in the balance of power between the federal government and the states, as well as a challenge to the political establishment that had long controlled the levers of power in Washington. Jackson's supporters believed that he would be a president who would break free from the traditional political norms and act as a true representative of the people. However, Jackson's presidency would not be without its challenges. His approach to leadership, while popular with many Americans, was also controversial. Jackson's fiery temperament and his willingness to challenge established norms created both admiration and fear. His presidency would be marked by bold decisions, fierce political battles, and a determination to implement his vision for the nation no matter the cost. As Jackson took office, it was clear that he was not just a military hero, but a man who would leave his mark on American politics for generations to come. Jackson's inauguration in 1829 was a momentous occasion, filled with energy and excitement. His supporters flooded into Washington, D.C., to witness the arrival of the man they believed would bring real change to the nation. The celebration was raucous and chaotic, reflecting the populist nature of Jackson's campaign. This scene was a far cry from the dignified, formal inaugurations of previous presidents. Jackson's ascension to the presidency represented a victory for those who had long felt excluded from the political process, and his inauguration marked the beginning of a new era in American politics. As Jackson stood on the steps of the White House, having officially taken the oath of office, the future of the United States seemed poised for a transformation. His presidency would be defined by his unyielding desire to challenge the established political order, his vision for a strong and united nation, and his commitment to implementing policies that he believed would benefit the American people. His victory in 1828 was not just the culmination of his personal journey. It was also a reflection of the changing dynamics in American society, an era where the voice of the common man was becoming more prominent and influential in the nation's political discourse. Jackson's presidency would not be without controversy, but his election marked a defining moment in American history. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the nation's political story, one in which the principles of democracy and populism would play a more prominent role. Jackson's victory in 1828 was a triumph for the common people, and it marked the beginning of a presidency that would forever alter the course of American history. Jackson's first term as president was defined by both his vision for a strong federal government and his commitment to the democratic ideals of the common people. However, his presidency quickly faced challenges, the most significant of which was the nullification crisis. This crisis, which arose between Jackson's administration and the state of South Carolina, tested both his resolve and his belief in the preservation of the Union. The nullification crisis stemmed from the economic difficulties faced by southern states, which relied heavily on agriculture and the export of crops like cotton. In 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of Abominations, which imposed high tariffs on imported goods. While the tariff was intended to protect northern industries, it placed a heavy burden on the southern states, which had little industry of their own and had to pay more for goods that they needed. South Carolina in particular was angry about the tariff, which they saw as unfair and detrimental to their economy. In response, South Carolina's political leaders, led by John C. Calhoun, the vice president under Jackson, argued that states had the right to nullify or invalidate federal laws that they deemed unconstitutional. Calhoun's doctrine of nullification was based on the belief that the states, as sovereign entities, had the authority to reject federal legislation that they believed violated their rights. This idea was rooted in the notion that the federal government's power should be limited, and that individual states had the final say on what was constitutional. Jackson, however, was resolutely opposed to nullification. He believed that the Union should be preserved at all costs and that no state had the right to defy federal law. Jackson's commitment to a strong Union was a core part of his political ideology, and he saw the threat of nullification as an existential challenge to the authority of the federal government. For Jackson, the survival of the Union was paramount, and he was determined to defend it against any attempt to fracture it. In 1832, South Carolina held a convention that declared the tariff null and void within the state's borders. The state also threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government attempted to enforce the tariff. This was a direct challenge to Jackson's authority as president, and it presented him with a difficult decision. Jackson, whose loyalty to the Union was unwavering, responded decisively. He issued a proclamation condemning the doctrine of nullification, declaring that it was illegal and that the federal government would use force if necessary to enforce the law. Jackson's response to the nullification crisis marked a defining moment in his presidency. He showed that he was willing to use the power of the federal government to preserve the Union, even if it meant taking a strong and confrontational stance. He sent federal troops to South Carolina and urged Congress to pass a force bill, which would authorize him to use military force to ensure compliance with federal law. Jackson's willingness to use military force to preserve the Union earned him the admiration of his supporters, but it also made him a controversial figure. Despite the tension, Jackson managed to avoid armed conflict. South Carolina, realizing that they could not win a military confrontation with the federal government, backed down. The crisis was eventually resolved with a compromise tariff, which lowered the duties that had so angered the South, but still preserved the principle that the federal government had the authority to enforce its laws. Jackson had won the battle to preserve the Union, but the nullification crisis left a lasting impact on the nation. The crisis also deepened the divide between Jackson and his vice president John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, a leading advocate for states' rights and nullification, resigned from the vice presidency in 1832 in protest of Jackson's stance. Calhoun's departure from the administration symbolized the growing tensions between the two men who had once been political allies. Jackson's opposition to nullification was rooted in his belief in a strong centralized government, while Calhoun's views were shaped by his belief in states' rights and limited government. Their ideological split would have far-reaching consequences, not just for their relationship but for the future direction of the nation. The nullification crisis also had a broader impact on American politics. It highlighted the growing divide between the North and South over issues of federal power, and it foreshadowed the sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. While the immediate crisis was resolved, the underlying issues of states' rights and the power of the federal government remained unresolved. Jackson's actions during the nullification crisis made it clear that he was willing to take bold steps to defend the Union, but they also revealed the deep divisions in American society that would continue to simmer beneath the surface. Jackson's handling of the nullification crisis solidified his reputation as a president who was not afraid to stand firm in the face of opposition. His leadership during the crisis demonstrated his commitment to preserving the Union and upholding the authority of the federal government. Yet, it also made clear that his presidency would be marked by fierce political battles as he sought to maintain his vision for a strong, united nation. The nullification crisis was just one chapter in Jackson's tumultuous presidency. but it was one that would resonate in the political landscape for years to come. One of the most controversial and tragic aspects of Andrew Jackson's presidency was his policy of Indian removal. Jackson's stance on Native American tribes, particularly those living in the southeastern United States, became a defining feature of his time in office and is a source of deep moral complexity in his legacy. The origins of the Indian removal policy can be traced to the growing demand for land in the southeastern United States, particularly in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. As the country expanded, settlers pushed for more land to cultivate cotton and other crops, and this demand collided with the Native American tribes that had lived on this land for centuries. Jackson, whose rise to prominence was closely linked to his military campaigns in the South, viewed the removal of Native American tribes as both a practical and a moral necessity. He argued that moving the tribes to lands west of the Mississippi River would allow them to live in peace, free from the pressure of encroaching settlers. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. The act authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes to exchange their lands in the southeastern United States for territory west of the Mississippi River. Jackson portrayed this policy as a compassionate solution, promising that the Native Americans would be given the opportunity to preserve their way of life in a new land. However, the reality of the policy was far different. Many of the Native American tribes in the southeastern United States, including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, resisted removal. They had deep cultural and historical ties to the land, and they viewed Jackson's policy as an unjust and forced relocation. The Cherokee, in particular, had made significant efforts to adapt to the ways of European American settlers. They had established their own written language, created a constitution, and developed a sophisticated agricultural economy. For the Cherokee, removal was not just a matter of losing land, it was an assault on their identity and way of life. The conflict over removal came to a head in the case of Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. The U.S. Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity, and that Georgia could not impose its laws on them. Jackson, however, was determined to enforce the removal policy. It is famously said that when Jackson was informed of the court's decision, he responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Jackson's disregard for the Supreme Court's ruling demonstrated his commitment to his policy, regardless of legal or moral considerations. Despite the court's ruling, Jackson continued to push for removal. The federal government signed treaties with several tribes, including the Choctaw and Creek, who reluctantly agreed to give up their land in exchange for territory in what is now Oklahoma. However, the Cherokee refused to leave, and their resistance would result in one of the darkest chapters in American history. In 1838, after years of resistance, the U.S. government forced the Cherokee and other tribes to embark on a brutal journey west, known as the Trail of Tears. Over 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were rounded up by federal troops and marched over 1,000 miles to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The journey was grueling and deadly, and it is estimated that approximately 4,000 Cherokee died from disease, exposure, and exhaustion during the forced relocation. The Seminole tribe also faced a similar fate, as they resisted removal, leading to the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. Thousands of Seminoles were forcibly removed from their land, many of them suffering during the journey west. The Trail of Tears remains one of the most tragic and shameful events in American history. Jackson's policy of Indian removal, while framed as an effort to provide Native Americans with an opportunity for peace and prosperity, resulted in the displacement and death of thousands of people. Jackson's actions toward Native Americans are widely regarded as deeply unjust, and his legacy in this regard continues to be a subject of intense criticism. Jackson's justification for Indian removal was rooted in his belief that it was necessary for the nation's progress. He argued that the presence of Native American tribes in the southeastern United States was an obstacle to the expansion of white settlers, and he believed that the tribes would be better off living in the West, away from the encroaching frontier. However, his vision of progress came at a tremendous human cost. The suffering of the Cherokee and other tribes on the Trail of Tears, along with the destruction of their cultures and ways of life, highlights the dark side of Jackson's presidency. Despite the suffering caused by his policies, Jackson's supporters viewed him as a protector of the American people, someone who was willing to make tough decisions for the sake of the nation's growth and prosperity. But for the Native American tribes who were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, Jackson's presidency remains a symbol of injustice and oppression. The legacy of Indian removal and the Trail of Tears has haunted Jackson's memory. While he is remembered as a champion of American democracy and an advocate for the common man, his policies toward Native Americans continue to stain his reputation. Jackson's role in the forced relocation of thousands of people represents one of the most painful chapters in the history of American expansion, and it stands as a reminder of the costs of progress when it is pursued without regard for the rights and dignity of others. The Bank War was one of the defining battles of Andrew Jackson's presidency. It was a conflict that would shape his administration, his political legacy, and the future of the United States economy. At its heart, the Bank War was a struggle over the power of the federal government, the role of financial institutions, and the interests of the American people. Jackson's fight against the Second Bank of the United States was not just a matter of economics. It was a deeply ideological struggle between Jackson's vision of a government that served the common man and the entrenched power of the nation's financial elites. The Second Bank of the United States had been chartered in 1816, after the First Bank of the United States had been disbanded in 1811. It was established to help stabilize the American economy, provide a uniform currency, and regulate state-chartered banks. The bank had powerful supporters, including many of the nation's political and economic elites, who believed that it was essential for the nation's financial stability. But Jackson saw the bank as an institution that concentrated too much power in the hands of a few wealthy individuals. He believed that it was an undemocratic institution that favored the interests of the rich and powerful at the expense of ordinary Americans. Jackson's opposition to the bank was rooted in his belief in states' rights and limited government. He argued that the bank was unconstitutional, despite the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in favor of its constitutionality in 1819 in McCulloch v. Maryland. Jackson viewed the bank as an instrument of aristocratic privilege, a tool used by the wealthy to control the nation's economy and keep ordinary citizens at a disadvantage. He believed that the bank's power undermined the sovereignty of the states and placed too much authority in the hands of private individuals, making it a symbol of what he saw as the corrupting influence of centralized power. In 1832, when the bank's charter came up for renewal, Jackson made it his mission to block its recharter. He vetoed the recharter bill, arguing that it was a monopoly that served the interests of the elite and not the people. Jackson's veto was a bold and controversial move. The bank's supporters, including Henry Clay, who was running for president in 1832, accused Jackson of overstepping his authority. They argued that the bank was vital to the nation's economic health, and that Jackson's opposition to it was politically motivated. Jackson's veto of the bank's recharter marked the beginning of a bitter political battle. The president's opposition to the bank resonated with many Americans who saw it as a symbol of the power of the wealthy and the political establishment. Jackson's populist appeal, the idea that he was a man of the people fighting against the interests of the elite, helped him build a coalition of support among ordinary Americans, particularly in the South and West. He argued that the bank was not only unconstitutional, but also a source of corruption and economic instability. To Jackson, the bank represented everything that was wrong with the political and economic systems of the time. Despite Jackson's veto, the bank continued to wield considerable power, and the struggle over its fate escalated. Jackson, determined to destroy the bank, began taking aggressive actions to weaken its influence. One of the most significant moves he made was to order the withdrawal of federal funds from the bank, directing that the government's money be placed in state-chartered pet banks. This decision was controversial and led to a political and economic crisis. The removal of federal deposits from the bank was seen by many as an attempt to cripple the institution and prevent it from using its financial power to influence national politics. The bank war came to a head in 1833 when Jackson's opponents, led by Henry Clay and other supporters of the bank, tried to use the issue as a political weapon against him in the 1832 presidential election. Clay, who had hoped to make the bank issue the centerpiece of his campaign, was defeated by Jackson in a landslide. Jackson's victory in the election was a clear signal that the American people supported his stance against the bank. The election results showed that Jackson's populist appeal had struck a chord with ordinary voters who were disillusioned with the power of the financial elites. In 1836, the Bank of the United States charter expired, and the institution was effectively dismantled. Jackson had succeeded in his mission to destroy the bank, but his victory came at a cost. The removal of federal funds from the bank and the destabilization of the nation's financial system led to an economic downturn. The Panic of 1837, a financial crisis marked by bank failures and widespread unemployment, was, in part, the result of the policies that Jackson had implemented during the bank war. Critics of Jackson argued that his war on the bank had contributed to the financial instability that followed. The bank war also had long-lasting consequences for the American political system. Jackson's populist rhetoric and his determination to break the power of the financial elites reshaped the political landscape, contributing to the rise of the Democratic Party as a party of the common people. At the same time, Jackson's actions set the stage for future battles over the role of government and the regulation of financial institutions. His victory over the bank was seen by many as a triumph for democracy, but it also highlighted the tensions between Jackson's vision of limited government and the practical challenges of managing the nation's economy. Jackson's fight against the bank also solidified his reputation as a leader willing to take bold, decisive action in the face of opposition. His battle against the institution was a defining moment of his presidency, one that demonstrated both his political skill and his deep commitment to his vision of the nation. But while Jackson's victory in the bank war marked a political triumph, it also left the country with a legacy of economic instability that would reverberate for years to come. Andrew Jackson's second term as president, from 1833 to 1837, was marked by significant political and personal challenges. While his first term had been characterized by bold victories, including the triumph over the Bank of the United States and his handling of the nullification crisis, his second term proved to be more complicated. As his presidency progressed, Jackson's physical health began to decline, and political opposition grew fiercer. Despite these challenges, his leadership continued to shape the course of the nation. In 1833, Jackson began his second term in office with the confidence of a political giant. His victory over the Bank of the United States had solidified his place in history as a president who was not afraid to take decisive action against powerful institutions. However, his second term quickly became embroiled in political battles that would define his presidency. The most notable of these battles was his ongoing struggle to dismantle the political and economic systems that he believed were controlled by a privileged few. Jackson's health, however, began to take a toll on his leadership. He had suffered from various health issues throughout his life, including lingering effects from his time as a prisoner of war and wounds from duels he had fought in his youth. By the time he entered his second term, Jackson was suffering from chronic pain and fatigue. His physical decline was evident to those around him, and it became increasingly clear that his health would affect his ability to govern effectively. Despite this, Jackson remained determined to press forward with his political agenda. One of the most significant events during Jackson's second term was his decision to address the issue of Indian removal more aggressively. The removal policy, which had begun in his first term, continued to unfold with tragic consequences during his second term. Jackson was deeply committed to the idea of relocating Native American tribes from the southeastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River, but the policy was met with increasing resistance from both Native American groups and some factions of American society. The forced relocation of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and other tribes to what would become known as the Indian Territory resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native Americans, a painful chapter in American history that would haunt Jackson's legacy. Despite the moral and ethical concerns raised by the removal policy, Jackson remained steadfast in his belief that it was in the best interests of the United States and the Native American tribes. He argued that it would allow the tribes to preserve their way of life in the West and give them the opportunity to thrive away from the encroaching white settlers. However, the suffering caused by the forced relocation, particularly the Cherokees' journey along the Trail of Tears, remains one of the darkest episodes of his presidency. Jackson's second term also saw growing opposition from political rivals, both within his own party and from the Whig Party, which was emerging as a strong opposition force. Jackson's decision to withdraw federal funds from the Bank of the United States had led to significant economic instability, and his critics were quick to blame him for the ensuing Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that saw widespread bank failures, unemployment, and economic hardship. Although Jackson's supporters defended his actions, arguing that the bank had caused the instability, the economic downturn severely damaged his popularity and left him politically vulnerable. In addition to the economic challenges, Jackson faced increasing political division. The Democratic Party, which had been united behind his presidency in his first term, began to fracture. Jackson's uncompromising stance on issues like Indian removal, the bank war, and his approach to government appointments created tensions within his own party. Some Democrats were uneasy with Jackson's centralization of power, and his adversaries within the party began to question his methods. The rise of the Whig Party, a coalition of Jackson's political opponents, further complicated his second term, and his ability to enact his agenda became more difficult. Perhaps the most significant personal challenge Jackson faced in his second term was the increasing strain on his health. The president's chronic illnesses, including severe pain from old war wounds, took a toll on his ability to perform his duties. His energy and vitality, once a hallmark of his presidency, began to fade. Despite this, Jackson's commitment to his presidency remained unshaken, and he continued to make decisions with the same intensity and determination that had defined his earlier years. However, by the end of his second term, it was clear that his physical health had declined to the point where it was impacting his ability to lead effectively. Jackson's relationship with his vice president, Martin Van Buren, also became more important as his health declined. Van Buren, who'd been a loyal ally throughout Jackson's political career, became a key figure in Jackson's inner circle. As Jackson's health deteriorated, he relied more heavily on Van Buren to help navigate the political challenges of his second term. Van Buren's political savvy and support for Jackson's policies made him a natural successor, and Jackson's endorsement of Van Buren for the presidency in 1836 was a significant factor in Van Buren's election. Despite the personal and political challenges he faced in his second term, Jackson's legacy as president remained significant. He had reshaped the American political landscape, challenging established institutions, advocating for the common man, and leaving a lasting impact on the nation's economy and governance. While his policies, particularly regarding Indian removal, would be heavily criticized in the years to come, Jackson's presidency helped define the modern Democratic Party and set the stage for the rise of political populism in the United States. By the end of his second term, Jackson had achieved much, but he had also left a nation deeply divided over the issues he had championed. His health continued to decline, and in 1837 he retired to his beloved home, the Hermitage, where he would spend the final years of his life. Though his physical strength had waned, his influence on American politics would be felt for decades to come. Jackson's presidency had altered the course of history, leaving a legacy that was as complex as it was consequential. After his tumultuous second term as president, Andrew Jackson retired from public life in 1837, returning to his beloved Hermitage plantation near Nashville, Tennessee. The years that followed were marked by a quieter existence, but Jackson's influence on American politics remained strong. While he no longer held the reins of the nation, his legacy continued to reverberate through the country, and his endorsement of Martin Van Buren in the 1836 presidential election ensured that his political vision would live on through his chosen successor. Jackson's health continued to decline during these years. The wounds he had sustained during his military service, combined with the toll of years spent in the demanding role of president, left him with chronic pain and physical weakness. Despite this, Jackson's sharp mind and forceful personality remained intact, and he continued to influence political events from his home at the Hermitage. While he was no longer an active participant in government, Jackson remained a formidable figure, particularly among his supporters in the Democratic Party. During his retirement, Jackson closely followed the political developments of his time. His support for Martin Van Buren's presidency remained steadfast, and he kept a keen interest in the political battles that continued to unfold. Jackson's influence on Van Buren's policies was significant, particularly in the early years of Van Buren's presidency. Though Van Buren had his own vision for the country, he leaned heavily on Jackson's advice, as the two men shared many of the same political views. Jackson's later years were also marked by personal reflection. He was often preoccupied with the legacy of his presidency, particularly regarding the policies he had enacted, such as Indian removal. While Jackson had always believed that his decisions were in the best interest of the nation, he could not escape the moral complexities of his actions. The forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands had left a stain on his legacy that would endure for generations. In his later years, Jackson would occasionally express regret over the consequences of his policies, but he remained steadfast in his belief that they had been necessary for the nation's expansion. The legacy of Jackson's presidency was not just about his policies. It was also about his role in shaping the political culture of the United States. Jackson was a populist, a man who believed in the power of the common people, and he sought to break the hold of political elites on the nation's government. His presidency marked the rise of the modern Democratic Party, and his commitment to representing the interests of ordinary Americans was a hallmark of his time in office. However, Jackson's legacy was not universally admired. His policies, particularly his stance on slavery and his treatment of Native Americans, made him a deeply controversial figure. His actions in the Seminole War, his role in the forced relocation of the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, and his strong support for slavery have all been the subject of intense criticism. Jackson's presidency represented the darker aspects of American expansionism, and his legacy remains complex and multifaceted. As Jackson's health continued to decline in his later years, his thoughts often turned to his family and his beloved Hermitage. He had always been deeply attached to his plantation, and the land was a source of both pride and pain for him. Jackson's relationship with his family was complicated, particularly with his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., whom he'd raised after the death of his own brother, but his bonds to the land and the life it had given him were unshakable. Despite his many political battles and the strain of public life, the Hermitage was a place where Jackson could find some measure of peace. Jackson died on June 8, 1845, at the age of 78. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy was far from forgotten. His funeral, held at the Hermitage, was attended by numerous friends, supporters, and political allies, a testament to the influence he'd had on the nation. In his passing, Jackson left behind a deeply divided legacy, one that would continue to shape American politics long after his death. In the years following Jackson's death, the country would continue to grapple with the issues that had defined his presidency. The legacy of Indian removal and slavery remained contentious, and the political landscape would continue to evolve. However, Jackson's influence on the development of the modern American political system was undeniable. His belief in the power of the people, his commitment to a strong union, and his advocacy for a limited federal government laid the groundwork for the political movements that would follow. Jackson's impact on American history is a subject of intense debate. His presidency was a time of immense change and transformation for the United States, and his actions continue to be scrutinized from both a moral and political perspective. Some see Jackson as a hero who fought for the common man and defended the Union, while others view him as a deeply flawed figure whose policies caused significant harm to Native Americans and African Americans. Ultimately, Jackson's legacy is a reflection of the complexities of American history, both its triumphs and its darkest moments. In his retirement, Jackson may have found solace in the quiet reflection of his later years, but his place in history was already secured. His life and presidency would continue to be a topic of discussion, admiration and criticism for generations to come. Andrew Jackson's passing on June 8, 1845, marked the end of a transformative era in American history. At 78 years old, Jackson had lived a life filled with conflict, triumph, and contradiction. From his early years as an orphan during the American Revolution, to his rise as a military hero, and ultimately to the presidency, Jackson's influence on the nation was undeniable. His death brought a formal close to the chapter of American history that he had so powerfully shaped, but his legacy would continue to resonate for generations to come. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Jackson was mourned by many of his supporters, who saw him as a champion of the common people, a defender of the Union, and a leader who had reshaped American politics. His funeral was a somber occasion, attended by numerous friends, political allies, and admirers. The event was held at the Hermitage, his beloved plantation in Tennessee, which had been a refuge for Jackson in his later years. It was fitting that Jackson's final resting place was on the land he had fought so hard to secure during his life. Jackson's death prompted an outpouring of respect from those who admired him, but his passing also sparked reflection on the moral complexities of his presidency. His supporters praised him as a man who had stood up for the common man, fought for American expansion, and preserved the Union. However, many others viewed his actions with criticism, particularly his policies regarding Native Americans, slavery, and his forceful approach to governance. The forced removal of the Cherokee, the Indian Removal Act, and his handling of the nation's native populations left a dark stain on his legacy. For those who believed Jackson's presidency represented the triumph of democratic ideals and the rise of the common man, his death was a loss of a revered leader. His actions were seen by many as necessary steps toward shaping the nation, and his leadership was admired for its decisiveness. Yet for others, particularly those who suffered due to his policies, his death marked the end of an era that had caused great harm to marginalized groups. The most prominent criticism, of course, was Jackson's role in the brutal forced relocation of Native American tribes, culminating in the tragedy known as the Trail of Tears. This painful chapter in American history, associated with Jackson's Indian removal policies, would continue to overshadow his achievements in the years to come. Despite the contrasting views on his legacy, Jackson's death also prompted reflection on his broader impact on American democracy. His presidency had marked a significant shift in the political landscape, transforming the executive office into a more powerful populist institution. Jackson had expanded the authority of the presidency, asserting the power of the executive branch over Congress and the courts in unprecedented ways. His populist policies, including the expansion of suffrage for white men and the undermining of elitist institutions, helped shape the political culture of the 19th century. In the aftermath of Jackson's death, the nation began to assess the full scope of his contributions. The Democratic Party, which Jackson had helped forge into a major political force, continued to carry his ideals into the future. His vision for a government that represented the will of the people, though flawed and inconsistent in its application, remained a guiding principle for future generations of Democrats. His influence was especially evident during the presidencies of his successors, particularly Martin Van Buren, who was handpicked by Jackson to carry on his political legacy. At the same time, Jackson's death marked the end of an era of one-man rule in the White House. His approach to governance, while often seen as effective by his supporters, was deeply controversial. His reliance on patronage, his dismissal of political opposition, and his strong-willed leadership had laid the foundation for a presidency that could dominate American politics. But it also revealed the limits of a system that placed so much power in the hands of a single individual. The nation would soon face new challenges, including the sectional conflicts over slavery and the ongoing expansion of the United States, which would culminate in the Civil War. Jackson's death also led to greater scrutiny of his policies and actions. The moral questions surrounding his treatment of Native Americans, the expansion of slavery, and his disregard for the rights of marginalized groups began to attract more attention as the country moved further into the 19th century. The horrors of the Trail of Tears and the legacy of the Indian Removal Act became points of contention for historians, politicians, and civil rights leaders in the years following his death. His role in these events would remain a key focus in discussions of Jackson's legacy. In the years following Jackson's death, the nation continued to grapple with the issues he had championed and the injustices he had perpetrated. His legacy would be debated, with some viewing him as a visionary who had strengthened the nation and expanded its reach, while others saw him as a deeply flawed figure whose policies had caused immense harm to indigenous peoples and African Americans. The complexity of Jackson's legacy became apparent, and his actions continued to be scrutinized by both supporters and critics alike. Jackson's death did not mark the end of his influence on American politics. His ideas and his presidency would continue to shape the future of the nation. In the decades that followed, the political culture he'd helped create would evolve, but many of the issues he had confronted, such as the balance of power between the federal government and the states, the treatment of Native Americans, and the expansion of slavery, would persist. Jackson's legacy, marked by both triumph and tragedy, would continue to influence the course of American history for years to come. Andrew Jackson's death in 1845 marked the close of a remarkable and controversial chapter in American history, but his influence continued long after he was gone. The country he had shaped, through his policies and his leadership, was entering a new era, one marked by the challenges of westward expansion, increasing sectional tensions, and the growing conflict over slavery. Jackson's legacy, with its deep contradictions, would become a subject of intense debate, and the impact of his presidency would linger long into the 19th century. Jackson's presidency had fundamentally altered the trajectory of American politics. He had been a champion of the common man, advocating for greater democracy through the expansion of suffrage and a more populist approach to governance. His approach to the presidency had centralized executive power in a way that was unprecedented, and his strong will and personal style set the tone for future presidential leadership. his defeat of the Bank of the United States, his response to the nullification crisis, and his policy of Indian removal all left indelible marks on the nation's political landscape. However, the consequences of his actions, particularly in regard to Native American removal, became increasingly apparent in the years following his death. In the years immediately following Jackson's passing, his influence continued through his hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, who assumed the presidency in 1837. Van Buren, a loyal ally of Jackson's, inherited many of the policies that Jackson had championed, including the battle against the Bank of the United States and the promotion of a more democratic government. However, Van Buren's presidency was immediately marked by economic turmoil, including the Panic of 1837, which had been caused in part by Jackson's economic policies, including his war on the bank and his move to withdraw federal funds. While Van Buren struggled to manage the aftermath of the economic crisis, Jackson's legacy in terms of his influence on the Democratic Party and his approach to governance continued to shape the political landscape. Jackson had forged a new kind of political culture, one that was more populist and less beholden to the traditional elites that had previously controlled American politics. The Democratic Party, under Jackson's leadership, became the dominant political force in the country, representing the interests of the common man against the political and economic establishment. Jackson's populist rhetoric advocating for the rights of ordinary people would continue to resonate within the party for decades after his death. However, Jackson's legacy was also marked by deep divisions. His policies, especially regarding Native Americans and slavery, became a source of moral and political contention. The Indian Removal Act, which led to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands, was widely seen as a tragic and unjust policy that caused immense suffering and death. The forced marches of the Cherokee, known as the Trail of Tears, left a lasting scar on the history of the United States and continues to be a point of intense criticism of Jackson's presidency. His legacy in this regard remains deeply controversial, as he is viewed by many as a figure who prioritized American expansion at the expense of the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries. Jackson's staunch support of slavery also remains a central part of his legacy. Throughout his life, Jackson was a slave owner, and he believed that slavery was integral to the Southern economy. His defense of slavery and his advocacy for its expansion into new territories made him a deeply divisive figure in the years leading up to the Civil War. While Jackson's policies helped strengthen the Union in the short term, his support for slavery, along with his treatment of Native Americans, ensured that his legacy would be a source of tension in the years to come. The 19th century saw increasing sectional tensions over issues like slavery and states' rights. Jackson's handling of the nullification crisis in 1832, where he took a firm stand against South Carolina's efforts to nullify federal tariffs, set the stage for future conflicts over states' rights. His belief in a strong, centralized federal government clashed with the growing Southern desire for more autonomy, particularly in relation to slavery. Jackson's death came at a time when these issues were beginning to divide the nation, and his legacy would play a part in the sectional conflicts that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. In the decades following his death, Jackson's reputation continued to evolve. To his supporters, he was a populist hero who had fought for the rights of ordinary Americans and stood up against the entrenched elites. His actions to expand voting rights and his commitment to a more democratic government were seen as foundational to the development of modern American democracy. His victory over the Bank of the United States, which had been seen as an instrument of elite control over the economy, was regarded by many as a triumph for the people. Yet to his critics, Jackson remained a deeply flawed figure, one whose policies had caused great harm to Native Americans, and whose support for slavery had perpetuated a system of injustice. His legacy, marked by both achievements and atrocities, is a reminder of the complexities of American history and the ongoing struggle to reconcile the nation's ideals with its practices. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Jackson's legacy continued to be reassessed, especially in light of the growing recognition of the rights of Native Americans and African Americans. Jackson remains a polarizing figure, one whose actions and policies have left a lasting impact on the nation. His presidency, though celebrated by some, is also viewed by many as a time of deep moral failure, particularly with regard to the treatment of Native Americans and the expansion of slavery. Jackson's death did not diminish his influence on American politics. His legacy continued to shape the direction of the nation, even as the country moved into new chapters of its history. Whether viewed as a defender of democracy or a symbol of its failings, Andrew Jackson remains a central figure in the story of the United States, a man whose actions and beliefs helped shape the country into what it is today. As Andrew Jackson's presidency came to an end, his influence over the political landscape continued to reverberate throughout the country. His legacy as a populist leader, someone who represented the will of the common people against the entrenched elites, was firmly cemented in American politics. Jackson's administration had not only reshaped the presidency, but also laid the foundation for a new political ideology, one that would fuel the rise of populism in American politics for years to come. Jackson's leadership style, often described as populist, was characterized by his belief in the power of the people and his disdain for the political and economic elites who had long controlled the nation's affairs. He believed that government should serve the interests of ordinary Americans, and that power should not be concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy individuals or institutions. This vision for a more democratic and participatory government was central to his political philosophy and became the cornerstone of the Democratic Party that he helped to build. In the years following Jackson's retirement, the Democratic Party continued to carry his political legacy. Under Jackson's leadership, the party had grown into a powerful political force, advocating for policies that prioritized the interests of the common people. Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, had been his loyal ally and was heavily influenced by Jackson's populist ideals. Van Buren's presidency, however, was marred by the Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that was in part the result of Jackson's economic policies, including the removal of federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. Despite the economic challenges that Van Buren faced, Jackson's populist ideals continued to guide the Democratic Party. Jackson's emphasis on the common man and his belief that the federal government should be accountable to the people remained central to the party's platform. The Democrats, under Jackson's influence, positioned themselves as the party of the ordinary citizen, contrasting themselves with the Whigs, who were seen as the party of the elites and the established political order. Jackson's populism resonated particularly with voters in the South and West, regions where agricultural interests and frontier settlers had long felt excluded from the political process. Jackson's appeal to these groups, especially his support for westward expansion and his opposition to the power of the Bank of the United States, helped solidify his political base. His leadership of the Democratic Party marked a shift in American politics toward a more populist and less aristocratic form of governance. The influence of Jackson's presidency also extended to his approach to governance. His belief in the strength of the executive branch and his use of presidential power to achieve his policy goals set a precedent for future presidents. Jackson was often willing to use his power to push through controversial measures, whether it was his veto of the bank's recharter or his forceful response to the nullification crisis. His example of presidential assertiveness would be followed by subsequent presidents, even as his policies and political style faced increasing scrutiny. Jackson's influence on the Democratic Party also helped to shape the party's platform in the years after his presidency. The Democrats, under his leadership, became the party of states' rights, limited government, and westward expansion. Jackson's opposition to the Bank of the United States was one of his most defining moments, and his destruction of the bank was seen as a victory for the people against the economic elites. This anti-bank sentiment continued to be a key element of the Democratic Party's platform, especially in the early years following Jackson's presidency. However, Jackson's populism was not without its contradictions. While he championed the rights of the common people, his policies toward Native Americans and his staunch support for slavery have left a dark stain on his legacy. Jackson's Indian removal policy, which led to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi River, remains one of the most controversial aspects of his presidency. His support for slavery, which was integral to his personal wealth and the economy of the South, also places him at odds with the modern ideals of equality and justice. Despite these contradictions, Jackson's influence on the Democratic Party and the rise of populism in American politics cannot be denied. He was a figure who reshaped the way Americans thought about government and the role of the presidency. His focus on the common man, his opposition to the power of the elite, and his belief in the strength of the Union all became central themes in the Democratic Party's ideology. In the years following Jackson's death, his influence continued to be felt within the Democratic Party. His image as a populist hero was used to rally voters and strengthen the party's political position. Even as his policies were scrutinized and criticized, Jackson's legacy as the champion of the common people lived on in the rhetoric and platform of the Democrats. Jackson's belief in the power of the people and his commitment to limiting the influence of the elites remained central to the Democratic Party's identity. The legacy of Andrew Jackson was one of both triumph and tragedy. While he helped to democratize American politics and expand the power of the presidency, his policies toward Native Americans and his support for slavery left a moral stain on his legacy. His actions, particularly in the areas of Indian removal and the preservation of slavery, continue to be points of contention for historians and political analysts. Yet despite these moral complexities, Jackson's impact on American politics and the development of the Democratic Party remains undeniable. Jackson's influence on the rise of populism in American politics can still be seen in the political landscape of the 21st century. His belief that the government should serve the interests of the people and his opposition to the power of the political and economic elite continue to resonate with political movements that seek to challenge the established order. Jackson's presidency, while controversial, represents a key moment in the evolution of American democracy, a moment when the power of the people began to take center stage in the nation's political discourse. Andrew Jackson's presidency, like much of his life, was deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery. As a man born in the South, a landowner, and a plantation owner himself, Jackson was an ardent supporter of slavery, and it played a critical role in both his personal life and his policies as president. His stance on slavery not only influenced his own political career, but also had profound implications for the broader history of the United States. Jackson inherited a significant amount of land and slaves from his family, and his plantation, the Hermitage, became a symbol of the wealth and power that slavery could provide in the South. Jackson owned hundreds of slaves during his lifetime, and he relied on their labor to sustain his plantation's agricultural operations. For Jackson, slavery was not just an economic necessity, it was deeply ingrained in his worldview and in his vision for the future of the South. His position on slavery was consistent and unapologetic. Jackson believed that slavery was vital to the economy of the South, and he worked to protect and expand it throughout his presidency. He viewed the institution as an essential part of the Southern way of life, and saw it as the cornerstone of the region's economic success. Jackson's support for slavery was not limited to his personal life. It extended to his political actions as well. He was a fierce defender of Southern interests, and that included the preservation and expansion of slavery into new territories. One of the key moments in Jackson's relationship with slavery came during his first term in office, when the issue of slavery's expansion into the Western territories became a central concern. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether slavery would be allowed in the new states and territories was one of the most contentious issues facing the nation. Jackson, as a staunch supporter of Southern slavery, was an advocate for its expansion into the Western territories, arguing that slavery should be allowed to spread wherever settlers chose to establish new states. Jackson's support for the expansion of slavery was deeply controversial, both within the United States and internationally. The debate over slavery's expansion highlighted the growing sectional divide between the North and South, and it foreshadowed the larger national conflict that would eventually culminate in the Civil War. While Jackson's policies were widely supported in the South, they were vehemently opposed by abolitionists and many in the North, who saw slavery as a moral wrong and a threat to the nation's ideals of liberty and equality. Throughout his presidency, Jackson's stance on slavery was uncompromising. He saw the preservation and expansion of slavery as essential to the South's economic prosperity and political power. He believed that the Southern states had the right to determine their own economic systems, and that included the right to maintain the institution of slavery. Jackson's political decisions, including his support for the annexation of Texas and his desire to secure new territories for the expansion of slavery, were driven by his commitment to safeguarding the interests of slaveholding states. Jackson's policies regarding slavery also had a significant impact on the broader national political landscape. His presidency marked the rise of the Democratic Party as a force that championed the rights of slaveholders and the interests of the South. Under Jackson's leadership, the Democratic Party became the party of states' rights, pro-slavery expansion, and limited government. Jackson's strong support for slavery helped solidify the South's position within the Democratic Party and ensured that slavery would remain a central issue in American politics for decades to come. However, Jackson's policies on slavery also contributed to the growing tensions between the North and South. The more Jackson pushed for the expansion of slavery into new territories, the more entrenched the sectional divide became. The issue of slavery would continue to dominate American politics, even as Jackson left office. His policies helped set the stage for the political battles that would follow, including the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and ultimately the Civil War. Jackson's role in the expansion of slavery is one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy. While he is often remembered for his contributions to American democracy and his role in strengthening the Union, his unwavering support for slavery remains a dark chapter in his political career. The institution of slavery, which Jackson defended so staunchly, was not only an economic system, but also a deeply entrenched social hierarchy that dehumanized millions of African Americans. Jackson's support for this system and his efforts to expand it into the Western territories played a significant role in perpetuating the suffering of enslaved people. Despite his political success and the lasting impact of his policies, Jackson's support for slavery leaves a lasting stain on his legacy. His presidency represents the tension between the ideals of American liberty and the reality of the institution of slavery. Jackson's role in the expansion of slavery reveals the deep moral contradictions at the heart of American democracy during the 19th century. His actions, while driven by his vision for the future of the South, ultimately contributed to the nation's eventual reckoning with slavery and its abolition. Jackson's support for slavery and its expansion into the Western territories was not just a personal belief. It was central to his political identity and his vision for the future of the United States. His presidency, marked by triumphs and controversies, would forever be remembered for its legacy of promoting the interests of slaveholding states and expanding the reach of slavery into new territories. Jackson's views on slavery would become a key point of contention in the years leading up to the Civil War, and his actions continue to influence the national conversation about race, equality, and justice. As Andrew Jackson entered his second term in office in 1833, he was riding high from the political victories of his first term. His successful battle against the Bank of the United States and his resolution of the nullification crisis had earned him widespread popularity, particularly among the common people who felt that he was fighting for their interests. However, Jackson's second term would prove to be more challenging and contentious, with growing political opposition, economic difficulties, and personal health issues complicating his leadership. One of the first challenges Jackson faced in his second term was the continuing fallout from his war on the Bank of the United States. Jackson's decision to remove federal deposits from the bank and place them in state-chartered banks had ignited fierce opposition from the bank's supporters. These opponents, including prominent figures such as Henry Clay and Nicholas Biddle, the president of the bank, were determined to undermine Jackson's policies and restore the bank's power. While Jackson had won the political battle over the bank's recharter in 1832, the economic consequences of his actions were becoming increasingly evident. The withdrawal of federal funds from the bank led to a destabilization of the nation's financial system, and by 1837, the country was facing a severe economic downturn known as the Panic of 1837. The panic was marked by widespread bank failures, high unemployment, and a collapse in the value of paper currency. While Jackson's supporters argued that the economic crisis was the result of the bank's reckless practices, his opponents blamed him for creating the conditions that led to the financial collapse. The economic crisis of 1837 dealt a severe blow to Jackson's popularity. Though he had successfully navigated the political turmoil of his first term, the financial panic left him vulnerable to criticism. Many of his critics, including Whigs and some members of his own party, used the crisis as evidence that Jackson's policies had been reckless and damaging to the nation's economy. Jackson, however, remained steadfast in his belief that the Bank of the United States was a corrupt institution, and he believed that the economic turmoil was a necessary consequence of dismantling an institution that concentrated too much power in the hands of a few elites. The Panic of 1837 also presented Jackson with the difficult question of how to manage the nation's finances during a time of economic uncertainty. Jackson's response was to endorse the use of hard money, gold and silver, as the foundation of the nation's currency. He believed that the paper money issued by state-chartered banks was unstable and contributed to the economic chaos. Jackson's focus on hard money reflected his belief that the government should be free from the influence of banks and financial elites. However, his hard money policies further exacerbated the economic downturn, as the lack of paper currency made it harder for businesses to obtain credit and conduct transactions. Jackson's second term was also marked by growing political opposition, particularly from the emerging Whig Party. The Whigs were a coalition of Jackson's political enemies, including many former National Republicans, who opposed his authoritarian style of leadership and his policies on issues like the bank and states' rights. The Whigs saw Jackson's presidency as a threat to the balance of power in the government and were determined to curtail his influence. They portrayed Jackson as a tyrant who had overstepped his constitutional authority and was undermining democratic principles. The political battles between Jackson and the Whigs became increasingly bitter, with both sides using personal attacks and political maneuvering to gain the upper hand. One of the most significant issues during Jackson's second term was his continued advocacy for Indian removal. The policy that had been enacted during his first term, the forced relocation of Native American tribes from the southeastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River, continued to unfold in his second term. While the removal policy was widely supported in the South, where land-hungry settlers sought to expand westward, it was increasingly seen as an injustice by many Americans. The policy led to the infamous Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee, Choctaw, and other Native American tribes were forced to march hundreds of miles to the Indian Territory. The suffering caused by the removals became a source of moral outrage, and Jackson faced growing criticism for his role in the policy. Jackson's second term was also marked by his declining health. He had suffered from various illnesses and injuries throughout his life, including the physical toll of his military service and the wounds he had received during duels and battles. By the time of his second term, Jackson was a physically weakened man, often suffering from intense pain and fatigue. His health issues were compounded by the stresses of the presidency, including the ongoing political opposition and the economic crisis. As his health deteriorated, Jackson became increasingly reliant on his close allies, including his vice president Martin Van Buren, to manage the day-to-day affairs of government. Despite these challenges, Jackson remained a formidable political force. His unwavering commitment to his principles and his determination to defend his policies made him a powerful figure. He continued to push forward with his vision for the country, focusing on his desire to limit the power of the federal government and protect the interests of ordinary Americans. Jackson's resolve in the face of adversity, both personal and political, earned him the admiration of his supporters and the fear of his opponents. As Jackson's second term drew to a close, it was clear that his presidency had changed the course of American history. His policies had reshaped the nation's economy, its political system, and its relationship with Native Americans. His populist approach to leadership had empowered ordinary citizens and altered the balance of power between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Jackson had expanded the power of the presidency in ways that would influence future leaders, but he had also left a legacy of division and controversy that would continue to shape American politics long after he left office. Andrew Jackson's presidency, marked by his strong populist style and his forceful actions on key issues, left an indelible imprint on the political landscape of the United States. Even after his death in 1845, Jackson's influence continued to be felt throughout the nation. His legacy, however, was a complex and divisive one. While he was lauded as a champion of the common man, his policies, particularly toward Native Americans and slavery, left a lasting stain on his reputation. Jackson's most significant political legacy was his role in shaping the modern Democratic Party. His presidency marked the rise of political populism and the expansion of the electorate, particularly through the expansion of suffrage for white men. Jackson's belief in the power of the people and his contempt for the political elites who had dominated the government for much of America's early history reshaped the role of the presidency. He expanded executive power in ways that had not been seen before, using his veto power aggressively and challenging Congress when necessary to pursue his vision for the country. Jackson's populist appeal made him a beloved figure to many Americans, especially in the South and West, where his support for expansion, states' rights, and the interests of ordinary citizens resonated strongly. He embodied the ideals of a self-made man, one who had risen from humble beginnings to achieve great success. His political base was built on a sense of personal connection with the people, and his populism would go on to influence future presidents, such as Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. However, Jackson's legacy was also deeply controversial. His policies toward Native Americans, particularly the Indian Removal Act, remain among the most criticized aspects of his presidency. Jackson's aggressive push to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands to territories west of the Mississippi River led to the suffering and death of thousands of Native Americans. The Cherokee Nation's forced journey, known as the Trail of Tears, became one of the darkest chapters in American history. Jackson's unwavering commitment to this policy, even in the face of moral and legal opposition, has forever marred his legacy. Jackson's treatment of Native Americans and his defense of slavery further complicate his legacy. While he is celebrated for his populist ideals, He was also a staunch defender of slavery, which he saw as vital to the Southern economy. He owned slaves himself and supported the expansion of slavery into new territories. Jackson's support for slavery, combined with his policies toward Native Americans, illustrates the contradictions at the heart of his presidency. He championed the common man while simultaneously reinforcing systems of racial inequality and injustice. In addition to his views on slavery and Native American removal, Jackson's stance on the Bank of the United States and his economic policies continued to shape the nation's financial system long after he left office. His destruction of the bank, while seen by many as a victory for the common people, contributed to economic instability. The Panic of 1837, which occurred shortly after Jackson left office, was in part a result of the actions he took during his presidency, including his decision to withdraw federal deposits from the bank and place them in state-chartered banks. While Jackson's supporters saw this as a necessary step to break the power of the financial elite, the consequences of his policies would be felt by ordinary Americans for years to come. Jackson's influence also extended to his political successors. His endorsement of Martin Van Buren, his vice president and close ally, helped secure Van Buren's election to the presidency in 1836. Van Buren, though a skilled politician in his own right, was deeply influenced by Jackson's policies, and much of his presidency was shaped by the Jacksonian vision. However, Van Buren's presidency was marked by the financial crisis of 1837, which led to economic hardship for many Americans. The economic instability that Jackson's policies had contributed to continued to be a challenge for the country, even as Van Buren struggled to manage the fallout. In the years after Jackson's death, his impact on the political culture of the United States continued to be felt. His populist ideals and his vision for a strong union left a mark on the Democratic Party, which continued to advocate for the rights of ordinary citizens and the power of the federal government. However, his controversial policies on slavery and Indian removal remained a source of division, particularly as the nation moved closer to the Civil War. Jackson's support for slavery and his role in the forced relocation of Native Americans placed him at odds with the growing abolitionist movement and the push for civil rights in the years leading up to the war. The legacy of Jackson's presidency is a testament to the complexities of American history. He is remembered as both a hero and a villain, a man who fought for the common people while simultaneously perpetuating systems of inequality and oppression. His actions, particularly in regard to Native Americans and slavery, continue to be a source of moral reckoning in the United States. Yet, despite these dark aspects of his legacy, Jackson's contributions to American democracy cannot be denied. He reshaped the presidency, strengthened the Democratic Party, and left an indelible mark on the country he helped shape. In the years since his death, historians and political analysts have continued to debate Jackson's legacy. Some view him as a champion of the common man, while others see him as a symbol of the contradictions and injustices that have marred American history. Regardless of the interpretation, Jackson's influence on the United States cannot be overstated. He was a man who left a lasting impact on the nation's political system, and his actions continue to shape the country's political discourse to this day. Andrew Jackson's legacy remains one of the most polarizing in American history. Upon his death in 1845, his influence on the nation was undeniable. Yet his actions and policies have sparked intense debate ever since. His presidency reshaped the nation in ways that both strengthened and divided it. The central question surrounding Jackson's legacy, whether he should be remembered as a hero who championed the common people or as a villain who perpetuated racial injustice, continue to provoke discussions among historians, politicians, and the American public. At the core of the debate is Jackson's populism. As a president, Jackson positioned himself as a defender of ordinary Americans, often positioning himself in opposition to the elite political and economic establishment. His presidency marked a shift toward greater participation in democracy, especially with the expansion of suffrage for white men, which broadened the electorate and gave more citizens a voice in the political process. Jackson's populist ideals were embraced by many who felt excluded from the political power of the time, especially in the South and West. Jackson's critics, however, argue that his populism was flawed, rooted in a vision that excluded significant portions of the population. His policies toward Native Americans and African Americans, particularly his staunch defense of slavery and his aggressive pursuit of Indian removal, undermine the notion that he was a champion of equality and democracy. His actions toward Native Americans, culminating in the forced relocation of tribes to the Indian Territory, known as the Trail of Tears, remain among the most tragic and controversial aspects of his presidency. Jackson's role in this forced migration, which resulted in the death of thousands of Native Americans, has forever linked his name to one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. Jackson's support for slavery further complicates his legacy. Although he is often remembered as a populist who stood for the common man, his definition of the common man excluded African Americans, whom he believed were vital to the Southern economy. His presidency came at a time when the institution of slavery was deeply entrenched in the South, and Jackson was an ardent defender of slavery's expansion into new territories. Jackson owned slaves himself, and viewed their forced labor as essential to the success of his plantation economy. His failure to confront the moral and ethical issues surrounding slavery reflects a deeply problematic aspect of his legacy. These policies, his support for slavery and his treatment of Native Americans, make it difficult to view Jackson solely as a hero of democracy. The negative aspects of his legacy cannot be ignored, especially when the effects of his actions, such as the suffering caused by the Indian Removal Act and the continuation of slavery, are considered. For many, Jackson's advocacy for the rights of one group of citizens came at the expense of others, and the consequences of his presidency were felt by marginalized groups long after his death. On the other hand, Jackson's defenders emphasize his role in expanding American democracy. He was a president who sought to break the power of political elites and bring government closer to the people. Jackson's forceful leadership and commitment to strengthening the Union have earned him admiration as a man who embodied the spirit of American democracy. His victory over the Bank of the United States, for example, is often seen as a win for the common man, a decisive action against an institution that many believed represented the interests of the wealthy at the expense of ordinary citizens. Jackson's populist policies helped shape the Democratic Party into a force that would carry his political ideals forward for generations. Despite his controversial policies, Jackson's populism left an enduring mark on American political culture. He's remembered as a symbol of the rise of the common man in American politics. His belief in the rights of the people, his challenge to entrenched power, and his commitment to a more direct democracy helped to shape the political identity of the nation. Even in the face of criticism, Jackson remains an important figure in the story of American democracy, a man who, despite his flaws, helped to shape the country into what it would become. The division over Jackson's legacy is not just about his actions as a president. It also speaks to the larger issues of American history: slavery, race, and the treatment of indigenous peoples that continue to resonate today. Jackson's presidency was a reflection of the contradictions that have long existed in American society, where the ideals of freedom and equality have often been in conflict with the realities of oppression and exclusion. Jackson's legacy, like much of American history, is a complex and contested narrative, shaped by the perspectives of those who lived through it and those who reflect upon it in hindsight. In the years following Jackson's death, his legacy has been examined through various lenses, and the debate over whether he should be considered a hero or a villain remains unresolved. Some see Jackson as a bold and transformative leader who who pushed the nation toward a more inclusive democracy, while others view him as a figure whose policies caused lasting harm to vulnerable populations. Ultimately, the answer to this question is shaped by the values and perspectives of those who engage with his history. Jackson's legacy is a reminder that history is rarely simple or one-dimensional. Great leaders, even those who make profound contributions to their nations, can also cause harm and perpetuate injustice. Jackson's presidency offers a lens through which we can examine the complexities of American democracy and the tensions between ideals and practices. His life and leadership continue to provoke reflection on the ways in which America's history, marked by both progress and failure, shapes the nation today. While Andrew Jackson's presidency officially ended in 1837, the influence of his policies and the precedents he set continued to shape the course of American history, particularly as the nation moved toward the Civil War. Jackson's approach to issues like states' rights, the expansion of the Union, and his use of presidential power all set the stage for the divisions that would later erupt into the conflict between the North and South. Though he did not live to see the Civil War, Jackson's actions left a lasting imprint on the issues that would ultimately lead to the nation's bloodiest conflict. One of the key precedents Jackson set during his presidency was his staunch opposition to any challenges to the authority of the federal government. This was most dramatically demonstrated during the nullification crisis of 1832, when Jackson took a firm stand against South Carolina's attempt to nullify federal tariffs. South Carolina's effort to defy the federal government was grounded in the doctrine of states' rights, a principle that held that states had the authority to reject federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Jackson, however, viewed such defiance as a threat to the Union, and in response took aggressive action, even threatening military force to uphold federal law. Jackson's uncompromising stance during the nullification crisis became a model for future presidential actions. His belief in the supremacy of the federal government over the states would later play a crucial role in the events leading up to the Civil War. The Union was preserved during Jackson's presidency, but his firm position against states' rights sowed the seeds of conflict that would ultimately lead to a war over the very nature of the Union itself. Jackson's actions demonstrated the lengths to which a president could go to defend the authority of the federal government, even at the expense of deepening divisions between states. Another aspect of Jackson's legacy that played a role in the events leading up to the Civil War was his policy of westward expansion. Jackson was a strong advocate for the expansion of the United States, particularly into territories that would eventually become the Western states. This expansion was not without controversy, as it raised the question of whether new territories would allow slavery. Jackson was a staunch defender of slavery and supported its extension into the new territories, seeing it as essential to the economic interests of the South. The issue of slavery in the Western territories became one of the most contentious issues in the years following Jackson's presidency. While Jackson himself had died by the time the conflict over slavery's expansion reached its peak, his actions and support for the institution of slavery played a role in the tensions that led to the Civil War. Jackson's presidency helped to cement the divide between the North and South, as the North increasingly viewed slavery as a moral wrong, while the South saw it as vital to its economic system. The legacy of Jackson's populism also influenced the political climate leading to the Civil War. Jackson's populist rhetoric, which was based on his belief in the common man and his opposition to the political and economic elite, had a lasting impact on the Democratic Party. Jackson's vision of a government that represented the interests of ordinary citizens contributed to the rise of a political culture that prioritized the needs of the South and its agricultural economy. The Democratic Party under Jackson's leadership became increasingly aligned with Southern interests, and this alignment would continue to shape American politics in the decades that followed. While Jackson did not live to see the Civil War, his presidency set the stage for the political and ideological battles that would define the 19th century. His use of presidential power, his position on states' rights, and his defense of slavery all contributed to the tensions that eventually led to the secession of Southern states and the outbreak of war. Jackson's legacy can be seen in the political dynamics that played out in the decades after his presidency. As the nation struggled to reconcile the competing interests of the North and South. In many ways, Jackson's presidency is a precursor to the challenges that would unfold during the Civil War. His strong stance on federal authority, his support for slavery, and his belief in the expansion of the United States all laid the groundwork for the sectional conflicts that would ultimately lead to war. Jackson's influence, whether intentional or not, contributed to the shaping of the political landscape that would divide the nation in the 1860s. Jackson's presidency also had lasting consequences for the future of the presidency itself. His strong-willed leadership style set a precedent for future presidents to assert their power and influence, often overriding Congress and the courts in the pursuit of their policies. While Jackson's actions during his presidency were widely praised by his supporters, they also raised questions about the concentration of power in the executive branch, questions that would continue to be debated in the years leading up to the Civil War. Ultimately, Jackson's role in the lead-up to the Civil War is complex. His actions and policies contributed to the divisions that would define the conflict, but his legacy is also marked by his efforts to strengthen the Union and promote the interests of the common people. Jackson's presidency, while controversial, helped shape the political and ideological landscape that would define the course of American history for generations. Though Andrew Jackson's time in office ended in 1837, his influence on the presidency and the political landscape continued to reverberate long after his death. Jackson's presidency set critical precedents that future presidents, both in his party and beyond, would follow. His populist approach to governance, expansion of presidential power, and firm stance on certain key issues shaped the trajectory of American politics and the executive branch for years to come. One of Jackson's most lasting impacts on future presidents was his expansion of the power of the executive branch. Jackson believed that the president should be a strong leader who could assert authority when necessary, often overriding Congress or the courts to achieve his policy goals. His use of the presidential veto was unprecedented. Jackson vetoed more bills than all his predecessors combined. His 1832 veto of the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States in particular signaled to future presidents that the veto could be used not just to block unconstitutional laws, but as a powerful tool in the president's arsenal to further political objectives. Jackson's actions during the nullification crisis of 1832 further solidified his view of presidential power. When South Carolina attempted to nullify federal tariffs, Jackson took a firm stand in defense of federal authority, even threatening military force. This demonstrated Jackson's belief in the supremacy of the federal government, a stance that would influence future leaders as the nation faced growing divisions. Future presidents, especially during times of national crisis, would look to Jackson as a model for how to assert executive power. Jackson's approach to governing also had a significant impact on the role of political parties in American politics. Under his leadership, the Democratic Party emerged as a dominant force in American politics, with Jackson's populist rhetoric resonating with the common people. Jackson's commitment to a government that represented the interests of ordinary Americans contributed to the rise of a new political culture, where the presidency was seen as an office that could directly serve the people, rather than being solely an institutional body of governance. In the years following Jackson's presidency, the Democratic Party would continue to build on his political vision, even as it evolved to address new challenges. Jackson's appeal to the common man and his commitment to challenging political elites helped cement the party's role as the voice of the ordinary citizen. His belief in the importance of states' rights and his advocacy for expansionism also continued to influence Democratic policy positions in the decades following his presidency. While Jackson's Democratic Party gained strength, his influence extended to his political enemies as well. The Whig Party, which emerged as the main opposition to Jackson's Democrats, was founded largely as a response to Jackson's presidency and his consolidation of power in the executive branch. The Whigs, led by figures like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, believed that Jackson had overstepped his constitutional bounds and undermined the separation of powers. They favored a stronger role for Congress and more institutional checks on presidential power. The rise of the Whigs would lead to significant political battles in the 1840s and 1850s, culminating in the emergence of the Republican Party during the 1860s. Jackson's influence on the presidency and political parties also extended beyond the boundaries of his own time. The populist ideals he championed, particularly his belief in a government that served the interests of ordinary people, would be taken up by future presidents, especially during times of economic distress and political polarization. Presidents like Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin D. Roosevelt would all, in their own ways, draw inspiration from Jackson's style of leadership and his commitment to addressing the concerns of the common citizen. Jackson's presidency also set the stage for the political battles over states' rights and slavery, issues that would come to define American politics in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Jackson's strong stance on federal authority during the nullification crisis established a precedent for how future presidents would approach questions of states' rights. His defense of slavery and his support for the expansion of the institution into new territories also laid the groundwork for the sectional conflicts that would erupt into the Civil War. The enduring nature of Jackson's legacy was not without its challenges. His support for slavery and his role in the forced removal of Native Americans are deeply troubling aspects of his legacy that continue to spark debate. As the United States moved into the 20th and 21st centuries, Jackson's policies became increasingly scrutinized for their impact on marginalized groups, and his actions in regard to Native American removal and slavery were viewed in a much harsher light. The complexity of his legacy, his achievements in expanding democracy for white men, contrasted with his policies of exclusion for Native Americans and African Americans, has made him a deeply divisive figure in American history. However, regardless of the moral controversies that surround his presidency, it is clear that Jackson's leadership left an indelible mark on the United States. He fundamentally changed the way Americans thought about their government and their president. Jackson's presidency helped to solidify the role of the president as a central figure in American politics, and his populist approach to leadership influenced generations of future leaders. Jackson's actions also paved the way for the development of the modern American political system. His advocacy for westward expansion, the extension of slavery, and the growth of presidential power all contributed to the political environment of the mid-19th century. His presidency remains a critical turning point in American history, one that would shape the future course of the nation for better or worse. Following Andrew Jackson's death in 1845, his influence on American political culture, particularly populism, continued to resonate. Jackson's presidency had fundamentally changed the relationship between the people and their government. His emphasis on the common man, his mistrust of elites, and his expansive use of executive power set the stage for future political movements, particularly the rise of populism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Jackson's populism was rooted in his belief that the political system was dominated by a privileged few, and he sought to break their stranglehold on the nation's government. He viewed the federal government, particularly institutions like the Bank of the United States, as tools used by the wealthy elite to control ordinary citizens. His decisive actions, like his dismantling of the bank and his strong response to the nullification crisis, reinforced his vision of a government that worked for the people, not the elite. Though Jackson's time in office was relatively short, his populist ideals left a lasting imprint on American politics. In the years following his death, many politicians drew inspiration from Jackson's approach to leadership and governance. His populist rhetoric, his belief that government should serve the people, not the privileged few, continued to be a major influence on the Democratic Party, which Jackson had helped shape. Over time, his vision would help propel new waves of populism. The Jacksonian populism helped inspire future political movements that would seek to challenge the dominance of powerful elites. The mid-19th century saw a growing distrust of entrenched financial and political institutions, particularly as industrialization and urbanization led to a concentration of power in the hands of a few wealthy individuals and corporations. Jackson's populist message, which emphasized the importance of a government that worked for the people, laid the foundation for these movements, and his belief in a more democratic system resonated strongly with the populist and progressive movements that would emerge in the late 19th century. In the 1850s, as tensions over slavery, westward expansion, and states' rights reached a boiling point, Jackson's influence on political discourse became even more apparent. His belief in a strong union and his willingness to take decisive action to defend the federal government against states that sought to secede or nullify federal law set a precedent for future presidents during the crisis leading up to the Civil War. His legacy of strong presidential leadership would be seen in the actions of Abraham Lincoln, who would follow in Jackson's footsteps in using executive power to preserve the Union. While Jackson's presidency was defined by his efforts to safeguard the Union, it also left unresolved issues that would ultimately lead to the Civil War, particularly the expansion of slavery. Jackson had been a staunch defender of slavery and had advocated for its expansion into new territories. His actions during his presidency laid the groundwork for the political battles over slavery and states' rights that would tear the country apart in the decades after his death. Although Jackson's populist message had resonated with many, the implications of his support for slavery and his policies toward Native Americans left a complex and divisive legacy. Despite these contradictions, Jackson's influence on American politics continued to inspire future generations of leaders. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the progressive movement would draw on Jackson's populist ideals, advocating for reforms to address the growing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of corporate elites. Figures like Theodore Roosevelt, who championed the interests of the common man and sought to regulate monopolies and big business, often invoked Jackson as a precursor to their own political visions. Jackson's populism also resonated in the early 20th century with the rise of labor movements and agrarian reformers. In the face of industrialization, these groups saw Jackson's fight against concentrated financial power as an important precursor to their own battles for workers' rights and fair treatment. Jackson's advocacy for a government that served the interests of ordinary Americans laid the groundwork for the progressive era reforms that sought to rein in corporate power, improve working conditions, and expand the role of government in ensuring fairness and equality. Jackson's influence also reached the world of foreign policy. His forceful stance against foreign powers, particularly his strong response to British interference in American affairs during the War of 1812, and his aggressive stance in the Seminole War, set a tone for future American foreign policy that emphasized strength and independence. Jackson's approach to dealing with foreign adversaries, particularly his belief that the United States should not bow to foreign influence or pressure, influenced later American leaders, including presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who adopted a similarly assertive stance in global affairs. Though Jackson's presidency was often marked by political conflict and personal controversy, his populism and strong leadership left an enduring legacy. His presidency represented a shift toward a more dynamic and populist vision of American democracy, one where the president was seen as a protector of the common people and a defender of the Union. his legacy continues to resonate in American political culture, particularly in the rise of populist movements that seek to challenge the influence of the elite and ensure that the government works for the people. As the country entered the 20th century, Jackson's influence was reflected in the progressive reforms of the era, the rise of labor movements, and the ongoing debates about the role of government in regulating economic power. His populist ideals were invoked by figures across the political spectrum, from labor leaders to reformers, as a guiding philosophy for how the government should serve its citizens. While Jackson's personal policies and legacy remain controversial, his contributions to the shaping of American political thought and governance are undeniable. Andrew Jackson's legacy has evolved dramatically since his death in 1845. From his immediate posthumous recognition as a powerful populist president to the growing re-evaluation of his policies in the modern era, Jackson's place in American history has been the subject of both reverence and criticism. Over the years, Jackson has been memorialized as a heroic figure who fought for the common people, while also being condemned for his harsh treatment of Native Americans and his defense of slavery. Today, his legacy remains a polarizing topic, as Americans continue to grapple with the complexities of his actions and the contradictions inherent in his presidency. In the years following Jackson's death, his contributions to American democracy and political life were widely celebrated. As the Democratic Party, which Jackson had helped shape, became a dominant force in American politics, his legacy was enshrined as the foundation of the party's populist platform. Jackson was regarded as a symbol of the power of the people, a president who had challenged the elites and expanded the franchise to ordinary white men. His presidency was celebrated for giving voice to the common man, and he became a hero to many of his supporters. During the 19th century, Jackson's influence continued to be acknowledged, especially among his political allies and those who shared his vision for a strong populist government. Statues, portraits, and memorials dedicated to Jackson were erected in cities across the United States. In Washington, D.C., Jackson was honored with a statue in Lafayette Park, directly across from the White House. This statue, which depicts Jackson on horseback, became a prominent symbol of his leadership and political legacy. Jackson's portrait adorned currency, and his name was used to name towns, counties, and schools, further cementing his place in American culture. However, as the 20th century unfolded, Jackson's legacy began to come under increasing scrutiny. The social and political movements of the 20th century, particularly the civil rights movement, led to a re-evaluation of Jackson's policies, especially those related to slavery and Native American removal. The ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice exposed the deep flaws in Jackson's treatment of enslaved African Americans and his forced relocation of Native American tribes. Jackson's staunch defense of slavery, as well as his role in the tragic removal of thousands of Native Americans to the West, particularly the Cherokee, came to be viewed as significant moral failings. In the 20th century, a growing awareness of the injustices faced by Native Americans and African Americans led to calls for the removal of Jackson's statues and monuments from public spaces. The Trail of Tears, the forced migration of thousands of Native Americans, became a symbol of the brutality of Jackson's policies, and his role in this historical tragedy was increasingly criticized. The debate surrounding Jackson's legacy intensified, as historians, politicians, and activists questioned whether the honor and recognition Jackson had received were justified, given the harmful consequences of his policies. The re-evaluation of Jackson's legacy reached a new height in the 21st century, with the rise of the movement to remove Confederate monuments and symbols from public spaces. As the nation confronted the enduring legacy of racism and the legacy of slavery, Jackson's memorials became part of the broader conversation about how to reckon with America's history of racial injustice. In 2016, a prominent debate over the commemoration of Jackson culminated in the decision to remove Jackson's portrait from the $20 bill and replace it with Harriet Tubman, an iconic abolitionist and symbol of resistance to slavery. For many, this decision was a long overdue acknowledgement of the need to reframe the nation's understanding of its past. Harriet Tubman, who had risked her life to free enslaved people via the Underground Railroad, became a powerful symbol of the fight for freedom and equality, while Jackson's legacy became associated with the injustices of slavery and the mistreatment of Native Americans. While some still defend Jackson's legacy, particularly his role in expanding American democracy and his championing of the common man, the moral weight of his actions on slavery and Native American removal has led to a growing consensus that his legacy should be critically examined. Jackson's populism, while influential, is now viewed through the lens of the harm it caused to marginalized communities. As debates continue over how to balance historical recognition with ethical responsibility, Jackson's image remains a focal point in the ongoing conversation about race, power, and justice in America. In many ways, Jackson's legacy mirrors the broader complexities of American history itself, a history that is defined by both extraordinary achievements and deep moral failings. The struggle to reconcile Jackson's contributions to American democracy with the tragic consequences of his policies is an ongoing process that reflects the nation's effort to come to terms with its past. Jackson's impact on the United States, from the expansion of presidential power to his role in shaping the modern Democratic Party, continues to be felt even as the moral dimensions of his actions remain a source of division and debate. Today, Jackson's memory is contested. He remains a figure who represents the contradictions of American democracy, the ideals of freedom and equality alongside the realities of slavery, racism, and dispossession. His legacy challenges the nation to confront the complexity of its past and the enduring consequences of its history. Jackson's place in history will likely continue to evolve as future generations wrestle with the question of how to honor the contributions of a man who, for all his achievements, was also complicit in the injustices that continue to shape American experience. Andrew Jackson's place in American history is as complex as it is profound. While his presidency was defined by populism, strong leadership, and decisive action, it was also marked by deeply controversial policies that continue to shape the way we think about his legacy today. The final chapters of Jackson's life may have ended in relative quiet at his beloved hermitage, but the legacy he left behind continues to reverberate through the institutions he influenced and the national debates he ignited. In considering Jackson's legacy, it is important to remember that he did not live to witness the full consequences of his presidency. His leadership fundamentally altered the trajectory of the United States, but it also contributed to divisions that would later tear the country apart, most notably the Civil War. Jackson's actions, including his firm stance on federalism, his support for westward expansion, his defense of slavery, and his harsh policies toward Native Americans, all played roles in setting the stage for the political and ideological conflicts of the mid-19th century. Jackson's populist vision for the nation, his belief in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, was, in many ways, transformative. His presidency laid the groundwork for a more participatory democracy, particularly for white men, as voting rights were extended during his time in office. He believed that the people should have the power to shape their government, and his actions empowered ordinary citizens to challenge the political elite. Yet, while Jackson was a fierce advocate for the common man, the implications of his policies were more complex. The exclusion of African Americans, Native Americans, and women from the benefits of democracy highlights the deep contradictions of his populism. Jackson's defense of slavery, which he viewed as vital to the Southern economy, remains one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy. Despite his role in strengthening the power of the executive and advancing democratic principles for white men, his steadfast support for the expansion of slavery into new territories ensured the perpetuation of racial inequality for decades. His policies not only influenced the trajectory of American slavery, but also exacerbated the sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Similarly, Jackson's policy of Indian removal, which forcibly relocated Native American tribes to lands west of the Mississippi River, has left an indelible stain on his legacy. The removal of the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other Native American nations, resulting in the deaths of thousands of people, remains a painful chapter in American history. Jackson's actions in this regard are often viewed as emblematic of the broader injustice faced by indigenous peoples in the United States, and are a key element of the ongoing debate about his place in history. Jackson's presidency set a powerful precedent for the future of the American presidency. His assertiveness in using presidential power, his strong stance on national unity, and his willingness to stand up to Congress and the Supreme Court reshaped the executive branch. Jackson's actions expanded the power of the presidency, making it a more dynamic and central institution in American politics. Future presidents would look to Jackson's example of leadership, even as they sought to balance the use of executive power with the principles of democracy and governance. Jackson's impact on the Democratic Party was another crucial aspect of his legacy. The party he helped establish became the nation's dominant political force, and his vision of a government that served the interests of ordinary citizens remained central to the party's platform. However, Jackson's Democratic Party, while advocating for the common man, was deeply aligned with Southern interests and slavery. This alignment would have far-reaching consequences, as the party would later become a key player in the debates over slavery, states' rights, and federal power that led to the Civil War. In the years following Jackson's death, his memory was celebrated by many of his supporters as a champion of democracy and a defender of the Union. Yet, as the country reckoned with the realities of slavery and the treatment of Native Americans, Jackson's legacy became increasingly controversial. The moral questions surrounding his presidency, the forced relocation of indigenous peoples and his defense of slavery, forced the nation to confront the contradictions between its ideals of liberty and equality and the systemic oppression of marginalized groups. Jackson's memory is a reflection of the complexities of American history, both its achievements and its failings. His presidency was a transformative period in American politics, but the impact of his policies continues to be the subject of intense debate. For some, Jackson remains a hero who expanded democracy and fought for the rights of ordinary citizens. For others, he's a villain whose actions perpetuated slavery and caused immense suffering for Native Americans. His legacy, a blend of achievement and atrocity, underscores the ongoing struggle to reconcile the ideals of American democracy with the realities of its history. As we look back on Jackson's life, it is essential to recognize both the lasting contributions he made to the shaping of the United States and the profound injustices that occurred under his leadership. His story is a reminder that history is never simple, and that the leaders who shape the course of nations often do so at great human cost. Jackson's legacy, with all its contradictions, remains a vital part of the conversation about America's past and its future. In the end, Andrew Jackson's life and presidency serve as a mirror to the complexities of the American experiment. His name will forever be associated with both the expansion of American democracy and the systemic inequalities that mark the nation's history. The debate over his place in American history is ongoing, as future generations continue to wrestle with the question of how to reconcile the legacies of great men with the legacies of their failures. As we conclude our journey through the life and legacy of Andrew Jackson, it is clear that his influence on the United States cannot be overstated. Jackson was a figure who embodied the complexities and contradictions of the American experiment, From his rise as a military hero to his time in the White House, Jackson's leadership fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of the nation. His populist ideals, his expansion of presidential power, and his staunch defense of the Union left an indelible mark on American history. Yet his presidency was also defined by policies that caused immense harm, particularly to Native Americans and African Americans. Jackson's legacy remains a subject of intense debate. For some, he is a hero, someone who expanded democracy, fought for the rights of the common man, and strengthened the Union in a time of political division. For others, he's a figure whose actions perpetuated injustice, from the forced relocation of Native American tribes to his unwavering support for slavery. His story serves as a reminder of the complexities of leadership and the moral questions that arise when ideals collide with reality. The legacy of Andrew Jackson continues to influence the way we think about power, democracy, and the American political system. His vision for a government that served the interests of ordinary citizens has left an enduring impact on the Democratic Party and the populist movements that followed. Yet, as we reflect on Jackson's life, we must also reckon with the painful consequences of his policies, consequences that continue to shape the nation's history and its ongoing struggles for equality and justice. Ultimately, Jackson's story is one of transformation, both for the man himself and for the country he led. His presidency marked a turning point in American politics, one that ushered in new ideas about the role of government and the president, but it also left a legacy of division and contradiction, one that continues to challenge us as we look back on the nation's past and strive to build a more just future.